welcome to the channel. If you enjoy captivating stories and intriguing content, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss an update. Also, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. I love seeing the amazing places our community comes from. Thanks for being here, and let's dive in. In the pristine galleries of Manhattan's most prestigious art houses, Marcus Sterling moved with the practiced ease of old money. His perfectly tailored suits and encyclopedic knowledge of post-impressionist art made him a welcome figure among New York's elite collectors. What none of them knew in 2018 was that Sterling's real talent lay not in art appreciation, but in an elaborate confidence scheme that would eventually bilk investors out of more than $87 million. Sterling's method was as brilliant as it was brazen. He began by acquiring legitimate, though minor, works from established artists at auction. These purchases, while expensive, served to build his credibility in the art world. But it was his next move that demonstrated true criminal genius. Sterling hired skilled forgers from Eastern Europe to create nearly identical copies of his legitimate pieces, complete with artificially aged canvases and forged provenance documents. The real artworks were stored securely while Sterling used the forgeries as collateral for high-value loans from multiple banks and private lenders. Each replica was presented to a different financial institution, with Sterling claiming exclusive ownership of the original work. The genuine provenance documents from his legitimate purchases were shown to every lender, while the forgeries hung in climate-controlled vaults across the city. What made Sterling's scheme particularly effective was his careful cultivation of relationships within the art world. He donated generously to museums, hosted lavish gallery openings, and even established a small foundation to support emerging artists. These philanthropic efforts not only deflected suspicion but also provided him with a network of unwitting references who would vouch for his character and expertise. The fraud began to unravel in late 2019 when a junior authenticator at Christie's noticed something peculiar. During a routine inspection of what was supposed to be a Cézanne still life, she detected inconsistencies in the canvas aging that didn't match the painting's purported timeline. This discovery prompted a wider investigation, revealing that the same painting appeared to be simultaneously held as collateral at 3 different financial institutions. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered the full scope of Sterling's deception. Not only had he duplicated several paintings multiple times, but he had also created elaborate shell companies to handle the loans, making it difficult for any single lender to discover the multiple pledges of the same artwork. The scheme's sophistication became apparent when forensic accountants traced Sterling's money trail. He had used the loan proceeds to purchase real estate across Europe, invest in legitimate businesses, and ironically, acquire more authentic artwork to use as templates for further forgeries. The layering of transactions was so complex that investigators likened it to a Russian nesting doll of financial fraud. Sterling's downfall came swiftly once the investigation became public. Several of his Eastern European accomplices, facing pressure from international law enforcement, agreed to cooperate. They provided detailed accounts of the forgery process, including Sterling's specific requests for artificial aging techniques and his meticulous attention to matching brush strokes. The art world reeled from the revelation. Collectors and institutions that had welcomed Sterling into their inner circles now scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. The revelation that one of their own had so completely fooled them struck at the heart of the art market's reputation for diligence and authenticity. In the end, Sterling's scheme collapsed like a house of cards. He was arrested in 2020 at his Hamptons estate, where agents found a hidden room containing dozens of forgeries in various stages of completion. The final tally was staggering: 42 forged masterpieces, 17 defrauded financial institutions, and millions in losses that rippled through the art finance world. Sterling's case led to significant reforms in art-based lending. Financial institutions implemented new protocols for cross-referencing collateral, and authentication processes became more rigorous. The art world, chastened by the ease with which Sterling had operated within their midst, was forced to confront its vulnerabilities to sophisticated fraud. Today, Marcus Sterling serves a 15-year sentence in federal prison. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the intersection of art, finance, and human greed. The genuine artworks that launched his scheme were sold at auction to help repay his victims, while the forgeries were preserved by the FBI as training tools for future art crime investigators. In the heart of Pennsylvania's coal country, in the small, tight-knit town of Hazleton, Jan Lewan was more than a musician. He was an institution. A Polish immigrant with a radiant smile and boundless charisma, Jan was the self-crowned polka king. His concerts were jubilant affairs, drawing crowds of devoted fans, mostly older Polish Americans who saw in him a reflection of their own heritage and a symbol of the American dream. He sang with a booming, heartfelt voice, his band's cheerful music filling church halls and festival tents, promising joy and a connection to the old country. Jan's empire extended beyond the stage. He and his wife, Rhonda, ran a bustling gift shop filled with Polish amber and crystal. He organized lavish European tours, promising his followers the trip of a lifetime, often including a private audience with the Pope in Rome. To his fans, Jan wasn't just an entertainer, he was family. He remembered their names, asked about their grandchildren, and made each person feel seen and special. It was this deep, personal trust that became the foundation for his spectacular deception. It started quietly, with a simple proposition whispered to his most loyal followers after a show or over coffee in his shop. He was expanding his businesses, he'd say, and he wanted to offer his friends a chance to share in his success. He offered promissory notes, official-looking documents that guaranteed an incredible 12% annual return. In a world of modest bank interest rates, it sounded almost too good to be true. But the offer came from Jan, the man they trusted implicitly. So, they handed over their savings, $10,000 here, $50,000 there, drawn from pensions and retirement accounts. For a time, the dream seemed real. The interest checks arrived like clockwork, reinforcing their faith. As Jan's fame grew, so did his promises. The guaranteed return climbed from 12% to an astonishing 20%. He used the new money flowing in from eager investors to pay the returns to the earlier ones, the classic, elegant deception of a Ponzi scheme. He was a master showman, and his greatest performance was one of financial wizardry. He created a mythology around himself, hosting a televised polka festival, earning a Grammy nomination, and plastering his office with photos of him shaking hands with powerful people, including Pope John Paul II. Each achievement was another layer of armor, making him seem untouchable and his promises infallible. The first crack in the facade appeared not in a bank, but on a highway. In 2001, a bus carrying his polka tour group crashed, killing 2 musicians and injuring many of his elderly followers. The accident was a tragedy, but for Jan, it was also a financial catastrophe. Faced with lawsuits and staggering medical bills, the pressure on his phantom kingdom intensified. He needed more money and he needed it fast. The charming invitations to invest became more urgent, his promises more desperate. Meanwhile, in an office in Harrisburg, an investigator with the Pennsylvania Securities Commission, a methodical man named Alan Benyak, received a tip. A source, whose identity was kept confidential, raised a red flag about the promissory notes being sold out of a gift shop in Hazleton. Benyak was intrigued. He had seen countless schemes, but one run by a polka-singing local celebrity was a new one. He began to dig, making quiet inquiries and pulling public records. On the surface, everything looked plausible. Jan Lewan was a legitimate businessman. But the numbers didn't add up. No gift shop and tour company, no matter how successful, could generate the profits needed to pay 20% returns on millions of dollars in investments. Benyak's investigation led him to the investors themselves. He found them to be fiercely loyal, almost defensively so. They showed him their notes, spoke of Jan with reverence, and dismissed any suggestion of impropriety. They had received their checks, hadn't they? Jan was a good man. But Benyak knew the signature pattern of a Ponzi scheme. It functions on faith until the moment it doesn't. He subpoenaed Jan's bank records and the illusion shattered. The documents revealed a frantic circulation of money. Funds from new investors, like an elderly couple who had given him their entire life savings, were transferred almost immediately to pay the interest owed to earlier investors. There were no real investments, no high-yield businesses, only a gaping financial hole papered over with charm and polka music. The end came swiftly. Armed with irrefutable evidence, investigators raided Jan Lewan's home and business. The man who had built a kingdom on trust and a smile could no longer talk his way out of the truth. The news sent a shockwave through Hazleton and beyond. The Polka King was a con man. His followers, nearly 400 people who had believed in him so completely, lost everything. Their life savings, their trust, and the cheerful music that had once brought them so much joy now echoed with the sound of betrayal. Jan Lewan was sentenced to prison, his phantom kingdom reduced to a cautionary tale about how the most devastating frauds are often built not on complex financial instruments, but on the simple, powerful currency of human connection. In the early 2000s, a new star appeared in the rarefied constellation of the world's most elite wine collectors. His name was Rudi Kurniawan, a young Indonesian man with an effortless charm and a seemingly supernatural palate. He arrived in Los Angeles society not with a bang, but with the quiet pop of an impossibly rare cork. To the established circle of wealthy connoisseurs, CEOs, film producers, and financiers who treated fine wine like a competitive sport, Rudi was a prodigy. He was soft-spoken, generous to a fault, and possessed an uncanny ability to identify a wine's vintage, vineyard, and soul with a single sip. His generosity was legendary. He would arrive at exclusive tasting dinners carrying millions of dollars worth of wine, opening mythical bottles of Romanée-Conti or La Tache from the 1940s as if they were everyday table wine. He never asked for anything in return, only for the pleasure of sharing the experience. This earned him the trust and admiration of men who were famously guarded with their fortunes. Rudi wasn't just a guest at the table. He became the host, the curator of unforgettable nights built around wines most collectors only dreamed of seeing. He earned the nickname Dr. Conti, for his particular affinity for the rarest Burgundies from the Domaine de la Romanée-Conti. Soon, Rudi began selling wine from what he claimed was a vast, secret cellar filled with treasures he had acquired from European collectors. The provenance was always vague, but the wines were spectacular. At auctions, his presence electrified the room. Bidding wars would erupt over lots he consigned, and he personally spent millions, driving prices to stratospheric new heights. He helped build the collections of billionaire Bill Koch and other titans of industry, becoming the go-to source for the rarest of the rare. His operation was a river of cash, flowing from the pockets of the ultra-wealthy into his own, all in exchange for liquid history. The first hint that something was amiss came not from a financial analyst, but from a Frenchman with dirt under his fingernails. Laurent Poncet, the head of Domaine Poncet, a revered Burgundy estate, was a man who knew his own wines better than anyone alive. In April 2008, he flew to New York for an auction at Acker, Merrill & Condit, which featured a stunning consignment of his family's wine, all sourced from Rudi Kurniawan. As Poncet scanned the catalog, his blood ran cold. He saw a lot of his Classe Saint-Denis, a premier cru from vintages spanning 1945 to 1971. It was an impressive collection with one fatal flaw. Domaine Poncet didn't start making wine from that vineyard until 1982. The bottles were phantoms. Poncet immediately contacted the auction house and had the lots withdrawn. His journey had not ended, however, it had just begun. He became a reluctant detective, driven by a vintner's pride. He flew to California to meet the enigmatic young man who was selling wines that shouldn't exist. Rudi was apologetic and charming, blaming his mistakes on poor record-keeping and a confusing web of European suppliers. But Poncet was not convinced. He saw evasion in Rudi's eyes, not ignorance. Poncet's discovery was the loose thread that would unravel Rudi's entire tapestry of deceit. Other experts began to look closer. Bill Koch, having spent millions on Rudi's wines, hired private investigators. They discovered a pattern of anomalies. Labels were too new, printed with modern ink on modern paper. Some corks were branded with the wrong chateau or vintage. Bottles of 1947 Chateau Lafleur, a legendary vintage, were sold in magnum sizes that the chateau confirmed it had never produced. The details were subtle, but to the trained eye, they were screaming evidence of forgery. Rudi wasn't discovering rare wines, he was manufacturing them. The FBI was now on the case. On the morning of March 8, 2012, federal agents raided Rudi Kurniawan's home in the quiet suburb of Arcadia, California. They didn't find a pristine, temperature-controlled cellar filled with dusty relics. Instead, they found a counterfeiter's laboratory. The entire house was a factory of fraud. The kitchen sink was filled with old bottles, soaking to remove their labels. All around the house were piles of blank labels, stacks of corks, bottles of cheap Napa Cabernet, and meticulous notes on how to blend them to mimic the taste of priceless Bordeaux and Burgundy. He had recipes, stamps, and special paper, everything needed to turn a $10 wine into a $10,000 fantasy. The seller of illusions had been exposed. Rudy Kurniawan, the boy genius of the wine world, was arrested and later convicted, becoming the first person ever jailed for wine fraud in the United States. He had sold over $100 million in fake wine, preying not on the naive, but on the world's most sophisticated and wealthy collectors. He understood his victims perfectly. He knew they were driven by ego and the thrill of possessing something no one else could have. He didn't just sell them fake wine. He sold them a story they desperately wanted to be true, a performance of rarity so convincing that they drank the evidence and applauded for more. In the sun-drenched suburbs of Los Angeles during the go-go 1980s, Barry Minkoff was the American dream incarnate. He was a storybook entrepreneur, a charismatic teenager who, at the age of 16, had started a carpet cleaning company in his parents' garage. He called it ZZZZ Best. The name was catchy, the story irresistible. By his early 20s, Minkoff was a media sensation. He appeared on talk shows, was profiled in magazines, and rang the opening bell on Wall Street. He was the wunderkind, the self-made millionaire boy next door who proved that with enough ambition and hustle, anything was possible. ZZZZ Best was, on the surface, a phenomenal success. It grew from a local operation into a publicly traded corporation worth over $200 million. Its fleet of vans seemed to be everywhere, their logos a familiar sight across Southern California. But the carpet cleaning business, with its thin profit margins, could never justify such a spectacular valuation. The real engine of ZZZZ Best, the secret that dazzled investors and Wall Street analysts, was its insurance restoration division. This was the brilliant, hidden side of the company. Minkoff claimed ZZZZ Best had secured massive, multi-million-dollar contracts to restore buildings damaged by fire and floods. It was high-margin, recession-proof work, and according to Minkoff's books, it accounted for nearly 90% of the company's revenue. This restoration business was the company's crown jewel. It was also a complete and utter fiction. The fraud began not with grand ambition, but with desperation. The carpet cleaning business was bleeding money. To stay afloat, a teenage Barry started small, kiting checks and running up fraudulent credit card charges. But as his ambition grew, so did the scale of his deception. He needed to show explosive growth to attract investors, so he simply invented it. He created a phantom company built on phantom revenue. There were no multi-million-dollar restoration contracts. There were no damaged buildings being rebuilt by ZZZZ Best. It was all an elaborate illusion, meticulously crafted to fool the world. To make the fiction seem real, Minkoff staged a breathtakingly audacious theatrical performance. He created a shell company, Interstate Appraisal Services, run by a friend, to supposedly verify the restoration jobs and act as an intermediary with the insurance companies. When auditors from his prestigious accounting firm wanted to inspect a job site, Minkoff would find an unfinished building under construction, pay off a security guard for access, and escort the auditors on a tour. He would hang ZZZZ Best signs on the walls, walk them through the work in progress, and present them with binders full of flawless, forged documents, contracts, work orders, and insurance approvals. The auditors, convinced by the performance and the mountain of paperwork, signed off on the numbers every time. For years the scheme worked perfectly. Money poured in from the IPO and from bank loans, all secured against the non-existent restoration contracts. Minkoff used this cash to pay the company's real bills and to fund his lavish lifestyle of Ferraris, mansions, and powerboats. He was a master salesman, and his greatest product was himself. His confidence was his collateral. The first thread to be pulled from this elaborate fabrication came from an unexpected source, a disgruntled homemaker. In a Los Angeles Times article celebrating ZZZZ Best's success, Minkoff mentioned a specific, massive restoration project in Sacramento. A woman who had been overcharged by ZZZZ Best for a simple carpet cleaning job read the article. Annoyed, she did a little digging and discovered that the address for this supposed multi-million-dollar project was nothing more than a post office box. She passed the tip along. This was the tiny crack that would shatter the entire facade. The Los Angeles Times began investigating in earnest. Reporters could find no evidence of any of the major restoration jobs ZZZZ Best claimed to have. As the pressure mounted, Minkoff's carefully constructed world began to crumble. His associates, sensing the end was near, began to talk. The truth started to leak out, first as a trickle, then as a flood. The collapse was swift and spectacular. Just days before Minkoff was set to announce a hostile takeover of a rival company, a deal that would have been his crowning achievement, he abruptly resigned. He claimed illness, but the real sickness was in the company's books. Within days, ZZZZ Best was exposed as one of the largest accounting frauds in American history. The company was worthless, a hollow shell propped up by lies. The stock price plunged to zero, wiping out investors and leaving banks with hundreds of millions in defaulted loans. Barry Minkoff, the boy wonder, was revealed to be a master manipulator. He was arrested, convicted of 57 counts of fraud, and sentenced to prison. His story became a cautionary tale for the era of excess, a stark reminder that the most compelling stories are not always the truest, and that behind a facade of incredible success can lie an equally incredible deception, built not with bricks and mortar, but with charisma and lies. On Wall Street, Bernard L. Madoff was not just a player, he was the house. He was a market maker, a former chairman of the Nasdaq, a pioneer of the electronic trading that formed the bedrock of the modern financial world. He was a titan but a quiet one. His investment advisory firm, located on the 19th floor of Manhattan's Lipstick Building, was one of the most respected in the country. But it was his private wealth management business, operating secretly one floor below, that made him a legend. This business was the epitome of exclusivity. You couldn't just ask to invest with Bernie Madoff, you had to be invited. The clientele was a curated list of the wealthy and connected, Hollywood celebrities, powerful CEOs, major philanthropists, and prestigious university endowments. For them, Madoff was not a gamble, he was a sure thing. In a volatile world of market swings, his fund delivered steady, dependable returns of around 10 to 12% year after year, with an almost supernatural consistency. The returns were not astronomical enough to raise alarm bells, but they were solid enough to be irresistible. He was seen as a financial oracle, a prudent steward of wealth who had found a secret, safer way to play the game. The secret was his split-strike conversion strategy, a supposedly sophisticated method of using options to hedge against market downturns. When clients asked for details, they were given complex explanations that sounded brilliant and impenetrable. They received monthly statements printed on crisp paper, detailing dozens of trades in blue-chip stocks. Every transaction was listed, every share accounted for. The documents radiated professionalism and success. The clients, reassured, filed them away and watched their fortunes grow. The problem was that the split-strike conversion strategy was gibberish. The trades never happened. The statements were pure fiction. The entire wealth management arm of Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities was a colossal fraud. The real operation took place on the 17th floor, a world away from the legitimate trading business 2 floors up. This was a small, locked office, staffed by a handful of loyal employees led by his trusted lieutenant, Frank D. Pasquale. Here, there was no brilliant trading algorithm or proprietary strategy. There was just a Chase bank account. When clients sent Madoff their money, millions, hundreds of millions, billions, it was simply deposited. When they requested a withdrawal, the money was paid out from that same account, using funds from newer investors. It was the oldest and simplest of swindles. A Ponzi scheme, but on a scale so vast and audacious it was almost unimaginable. The elaborate work on the 17th floor was not trading, it was forgery. D. Pasquale and his team were masters of deception. They used old stock tickers and archives of historical price data to create the trade records. If a statement needed to show a purchase of IBM stock on a specific date, they would look up what the stock traded for that day and create a fake confirmation slip. They backdated everything, ensuring the fabricated trades always resulted in the steady, plausible gains Madoff promised. They were manufacturing a perfect history, a paper reality of flawless success. For decades, the illusion held. The myth of Madoff's genius was so powerful it became its own defense. There were warning signs, but they were dismissed. As early as 1999, a financial analyst named Harry Markopolos began submitting detailed reports to the Securities and Exchange Commission, stating bluntly that Madoff's returns were mathematically and strategically impossible. He laid out the evidence, arguing that no option strategy could produce such smooth results and that the sheer volume of trades Madoff claimed to be making would have left a massive footprint on the market, a footprint that simply didn't exist. Markopolos called it the world's largest Ponzi scheme, but the SEC, intimidated by Madoff's reputation and baffled by his supposed strategy, conducted cursory investigations and found nothing. The oracle was too powerful to be questioned. The end was not brought by an investigator, but by the force of a global financial collapse. In the fall of 2008, as markets cratered, Madoff's wealthy clients, like everyone else, panicked. They wanted their money. Redemption requests began pouring in, totaling an unprecedented $7 billion. But there was no deep well of investments to draw from. There was only the single bank account, and it was quickly running dry. The river of new money had slowed to a trickle, and the demands of the old investors became a tidal wave. On December 10, 2008, knowing the game was over, Bernie Madoff sat his two sons, Mark and Andrew, down in his apartment. They both worked in the legitimate market-making business on the 19th floor and had been kept completely in the dark. He told them he was finished, that it was all one big lie. The wealth management business, he confessed, was a fraud. Shocked and devastated, his sons left the apartment and immediately contacted a lawyer, who in turn notified federal authorities. The next day, FBI agents walked into the office on the 17th floor. Bernie Madoff, the pillar of Wall Street, calmly surrendered. When asked to explain his business, he admitted, "It's a Ponzi scheme." The news detonated like a bomb, revealing a $65 billion hole where people's life savings, inheritances, and charitable foundations used to be. The oracle was a fraud, and his temple was nothing but an empty room. In the sleepy central Florida city of Ocala, known more for its thoroughbred horse farms than for high finance, Lee Farkas was a king. He was the chairman of Taylor, Bean and Whitaker, TBW, which he had built into the largest private mortgage lending company in the United States. Farkas was not your typical button-down banker. He was flamboyant and charismatic, with a shock of white hair and a taste for the high life. He flew in a corporate jet, owned vintage cars, and held lavish parties at his Ocala mansion. To his employees and the community, he was a generous visionary who had brought thousands of jobs to their town. TBW's business model was, on its face, straightforward. It originated home loans, then bundled them together and sold them to larger financial institutions or government-sponsored entities like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. It was a high-volume, low-margin business that depended on speed and efficiency. By the mid-2000s, TBW was a Goliath, servicing over 500,000 mortgages worth tens of billions of dollars. From the outside, it looked like a model of success in the booming American housing market. But beneath this glossy surface of prosperity, TBW was a house of cards, and Lee Farkas was a maestro conducting an orchestra of fraud. The company was deeply insolvent. 4 years, it had been losing money, but Farkas, desperate to maintain the illusion of success and his extravagant lifestyle, devised a scheme of breathtaking scope to hide the rot. The deception was centered on a special relationship with one of its key partners, Colonial Bank, a major regional bank in Alabama. The scheme had two main components. The first was a simple but audacious program they internally called the Plan. TBW would pretend to sell pools of mortgages to Colonial Bank. The bank would wire hundreds of millions of dollars to TBW, believing it had purchased legitimate mortgage assets. In reality, the mortgages didn't exist. They were phantom assets, digital ghosts created on a spreadsheet. Sometimes they sold mortgages that had already been sold to another investor. It was a high-tech version of selling the same car to 10 different people. This created a massive, ever-growing hole in Colonial Bank's books, which TBW was responsible for but could never hope to repay. The second part of the scheme was designed to hide that hole. It involved a daily, frantic shell game. Key employees at both TBW and Colonial Bank would collude to sweep funds between accounts. They would move huge sums of money from one place to another just long enough to fool auditors and regulators, making it appear that all accounts were balanced. It was a precarious daily dance, a desperate effort to keep the music playing for one more day, hoping a miracle would somehow make the billions in fake assets real. For nearly 7 years, the fraud continued, growing more desperate as the hole deepened, eventually exceeding $1.9 billion. Farkas used the fraudulent funds not only to cover TBW's operational losses but to enrich himself and his co-conspirators. He believed he could outrun the lie that the housing market would boom forever and somehow allow him to fix the books. Then came 2008. The global financial crisis hit, and the housing market, the foundation of Farkas's entire empire, crumbled. Suddenly, credit markets froze and the flow of easy money stopped. The pressure on TBW and Colonial Bank became immense. In a final, desperate gamble, Farkas had Colonial Bank apply for $553 million in government bailout funds from the Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP. He hoped this infusion of cash would allow him to continue the scheme long enough for the market to recover. It was this act of hubris that led to his downfall. Applying for TARP funds triggered an unprecedented level of scrutiny from federal regulators and the Special Inspector General. Unlike routine audits, this was a deep, forensic examination. Investigators began to pore over the books of both Colonial Bank and TBW. They quickly found discrepancies, numbers that didn't add up, assets that couldn't be verified. The discovery was not a single aha moment, but a slow, dawning horror for the investigators as they peeled back the layers of deception. They found the spreadsheets for the plan, detailing the fake mortgages. They unraveled the complex web of daily sweeps. They realized that one of the largest regional banks in the country was effectively hollow, its value propped up by phantom assets from a mortgage company in Florida. In August 2009, federal agents descended. They simultaneously raided TBW's sprawling headquarters in Ocala and the offices of Colonial Bank in Alabama. The game was up. Colonial Bank was seized by regulators and promptly failed, one of the largest bank failures in American history. TBW collapsed into bankruptcy, throwing thousands of people out of work overnight. Lee Farkas, the maestro of mortgages, was arrested. The investigation revealed the sheer scale of his deception, a fraud that had not only destroyed two major companies but had also defrauded the U.S. government. He was convicted and sentenced to 30 years in prison. The king of Ocala was exposed as a desperate gambler who, faced with his own failure, chose to pull the entire system down with him rather than admit the music had stopped. In the gleaming towers of Frankfurt's financial district, Wirecard AG was more than a company. It was a national treasure. It was Germany's answer to Silicon Valley, a fintech darling that had risen from obscurity to a coveted spot on the DAX 30, the country's most prestigious stock index. Its CEO, Dr. Markus Braun, was a tech visionary in the mold of Steve Jobs, perpetually clad in a black turtleneck, who spoke of a future of seamless, cashless payments. He presented Wirecard as the engine of this new world, a sophisticated platform that processed digital transactions for a vast and growing global network of merchants. Wirecard's story was one of explosive growth. It had a knack for operating in the gray areas of the internet, processing payments for online gambling, pornography, and other high-risk industries that traditional banks avoided. But its real magic, the secret sauce that baffled analysts and delighted investors, came from Asia. A huge portion of its reported profits, billions of euros, supposedly originated from a network of opaque third-party acquirers, TPAs. These were partner firms in places like the Philippines and Singapore that handled Wirecard's business in the region. The profits they generated were, according to Wirecard, held in trust accounts at two major banks in the Philippines. This Asian operation was the company's powerhouse, but it was also a black box. Its inner workings were controlled by Wirecard's enigmatic chief operating officer, Jan Marsalek, a shadowy figure with ties to intelligence agencies and a reputation for living a life straight out of a spy novel. While Braun was the public face, Marsalek was the architect of the shadows, the man who managed the relationships that supposedly generated a river of gold. For years, this narrative was accepted almost without question. Wirecard was a champion of German innovation, and its stock soared, making its executives and investors incredibly wealthy. But from a newsroom in London, a small team of journalists at the Financial Times began to sense a foul odor. Led by reporter Dan McCrum, they published a series of articles titled "The House of Wirecard," which raised uncomfortable questions. They pointed to accounting irregularities at a Singapore subsidiary and found whistleblowers who described a corporate culture of forgery and deception. Wirecard's reaction was not one of transparent clarification but of aggressive warfare. It vehemently denied all allegations, branding them as the work of malicious short sellers colluding with journalists to manipulate its stock price. The company hired private investigators to tail the reporters. Germany's own financial regulator, BaFin, seemed to take Wirecard's side, launching an investigation not into the company, but into the journalists and the short sellers, even temporarily banning betting against Wirecard stock. The establishment closed ranks around its fintech star. The pressure on the Financial Times was immense, but they persisted. Their reporting hinted at a far greater deception: the possibility that the booming Asian business was a complete fabrication. This core question, did the money actually exist, hung in the air. To silence the critics once and for all, Wirecard commissioned a special audit by the prestigious firm KPMG. The company promised the audit would vindicate them entirely. The KPMG report, when it was finally released in April 2020, was a bombshell, but not the one Wirecard had promised. It was a masterpiece of professional frustration. KPMG stated that they could not verify the existence of the Asian profits. The necessary documents were not provided, and they could find no independent proof that the billions of euros held in trust accounts were real. They couldn't say the money was fake, but they crucially could not say it was there. It was a devastating blow. The endgame came swiftly. Wirecard's longtime auditor, Ernst & Young EY, was scheduled to sign off on its 2019 annual report. They too were now under pressure to verify the cash. The deadline to publish the report came and went. And again. Finally, on June 18, 2020, Wirecard dropped the announcement that shattered Germany's financial world. It admitted that 1.9 billion euros in cash, supposedly held in its Philippine trust accounts, likely did not exist. The truth was stark and simple. The entire Asian TPA business was a phantom. There were no real partners, no vast profits, just an elaborate network of lies managed by Marsalek to inflate Wirecard's revenues and stock price. The trust accounts were fake. The documents were forgeries. The digital alchemist had been turning lead not into gold, but into thin air. The fallout was catastrophic. Wirecard's stock price plunged over 99%, wiping out billions in shareholder value. The company filed for insolvency. Marcus Braun, the visionary in the black turtleneck, was arrested. Jan Marsalek, the master of the shadows, vanished. He reportedly fled on a private jet and disappeared, becoming one of the world's most wanted fugitives. The scandal exposed a breathtaking failure of regulation and oversight, leaving Germany to wonder how it had been so thoroughly fooled by a simple, audacious lie wrapped in the dazzling promise of a digital future. On the stately, gaslit streets of Boston's Beacon Hill, Charles Ponzi was a man of newfound importance. It was the spring of 1920, and from his opulent office in the Niles building, he projected an aura of supreme confidence and financial genius. An Italian immigrant with a checkered past that included forgery and smuggling, Ponzi had finally found a scheme worthy of his ambition. He wasn't selling stocks or bonds, he was selling a piece of the global postal system. His business was built on a fascinating and obscure financial instrument, the International Reply Coupon (IRC). An IRC purchased in one country could be exchanged for postage stamps in another. Due to the wild currency fluctuations following World War I, Ponzi discovered a remarkable arbitrage opportunity. An IRC bought cheaply in a country with a weak economy like Spain or Italy could be redeemed for stamps in the United States, where the dollar was strong, at a significantly higher value. These stamps could then be sold for cash. The profit, he claimed, was enormous, over 400% on some transactions. He founded the Securities Exchange Company and began seeking investors. His pitch was simple and electrifying. He offered promissory notes that guaranteed an incredible 50% return in just 45 days, or 100% in 90 days. In an era when banks paid 5% a year, the promise was intoxicating. To a city full of working-class immigrants and striving middle-class families, Ponzi was not a swindler. He was a savior, a man who had unlocked a secret path to wealth and was generously sharing it with them. The early investors were mostly fellow Italian immigrants from Boston's North End. They started small, investing a few $100s. And just as promised, 45 days later, they received their money back, plus the spectacular 50% profit. The news spread like wildfire. The lines outside Ponzi's office grew longer each day. People mortgaged their homes, cashed in their life savings, and handed it all to this charming man with a broad smile and an incredible promise. His agents, who earned a handsome 10% commission, fanned out across New England, pulling in money from clerks, police officers, factory workers, and even seasoned businessmen. Ponzi became a local hero. He bought a controlling stake in a bank, purchased a lavish mansion in Lexington, and was celebrated by the press as a financial wizard. When asked how he could possibly generate such returns, he spoke vaguely of his complex network of agents in Europe and the efficiency of his operations. He reveled in the adoration, positioning himself as a champion of the common man against the Wall Street elites. But there was a fatal flaw in his beautiful machine. While the arbitrage opportunity in IRCs was real, it was logistically impossible to scale. To generate the profits needed to pay off his investors, he would have needed to purchase and redeem a fleet of ships worth of coupons. An absurd number, far more than actually existed in circulation. The truth was, Ponzi barely traded any IRCs at all. His entire enterprise was a classic pyramid scheme. He was simply using the tidal wave of money from new investors to pay off the earlier ones. The first serious doubts came from the establishment Ponzi so publicly scorned. Clarence Barron, the publisher of the Wall Street Journal, commissioned an investigation. In a front-page story, he pointed out the logistical impossibility of Ponzi's scheme. He calculated that to cover the investments made, some 160 million international reply coupons would have to be in circulation. The actual number was closer to 27,000. The math was undeniable. Ponzi reacted with fury and bravado. He sued Barron for libel and opened his books for an audit, confident he could outsmart any accountant. For a time, his charisma held the line. His investors remained fiercely loyal, believing the attacks were orchestrated by jealous bankers who wanted to destroy him. Some even withdrew their money, then, reassured by Ponzi's confidence, reinvested it immediately. The end came not from the audit, but from a federal investigation into his use of the mail to promote his business. Investigators began to probe his past, uncovering his prior convictions. His house of cards started to tremble. A run on his company began. Fearing the loss of their savings, thousands of investors flocked to his office, demanding their money. Ponzi, in a remarkable display of cool, paid out millions to those in line, calming the panic temporarily. But it was only a reprieve. The state bank examiners finally shut him down, freezing his accounts. The audit confirmed what Barron had suspected. Ponzi was hopelessly insolvent. The millions of dollars his investors thought were working for them in Europe were gone, spent on paying out profits, funding his opulent lifestyle, and covering the commissions for his agents. He had taken in an estimated $20 million, the equivalent of hundreds of millions today, and left behind a trail of financial ruin. Charles Ponzi was arrested and eventually convicted. The man who had been the talk of the town, the immigrant who had seemingly beaten the system, was exposed as a common swindler. He gave his name to the very scheme he perfected, his story becoming a timeless warning that any promise of impossibly high returns, no matter how clever the explanation or how charismatic the salesman, is likely built on nothing more than the next person's money. In the hyper-optimistic glow of Silicon Valley, where visionary founders promised to change the world, no vision was more seductive than that of Elizabeth Holmes. With her unblinking blue eyes, her uniform of a black turtleneck, and a curated baritone voice, she was a ready-made icon. She was the founder of Theranos, a company poised to revolutionize healthcare. Her pitch was a miracle of modern medicine, a small, sleek box called the Edison machine that could run hundreds of complex blood tests, from cholesterol levels to cancer markers, all from a single painless pinprick of blood drawn from a finger. This wasn't just a new product, it was a promise of empowerment. It would democratize healthcare, making vital information accessible and affordable for everyone. No more terrifying needles, no more big vials of blood, no more waiting weeks for results. The vision was so powerful, so compelling, that it attracted a staggering amount of capital and a board of directors that read like a who's who of American power, former secretaries of state like Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, decorated generals and titans of industry. By 2014, Theranos was valued at $9 billion, making Holmes the youngest self-made female billionaire in the world. She was the blood unicorn, a creature of myth and legend in the tech world. But inside the heavily secured walls of Theranos' Palo Alto headquarters, the reality was a stark and desperate contrast to the public narrative. The Edison machine, the centerpiece of the entire company, was a catastrophic failure. It produced wildly inaccurate results, failed quality control checks, and could perform only a tiny fraction of the tests Holmes claimed. The revolutionary technology was a mirage. The company was not a laboratory, it was a fortress of secrecy and intimidation. Employees were siloed, forbidden from communicating with other departments. Dissent was met with swift termination and threats of ruinous lawsuits from the company's famously aggressive lawyer, David Boies. At the center of this culture of fear was Holmes and her secretive partner and company president, Sunny Balwani. They ruled with an iron fist, dismissing scientific reality as a lack of faith and demanding absolute loyalty to the vision, no matter how disconnected it was from the truth. To maintain the illusion, Holmes and Balwani orchestrated a breathtaking deception. When they landed a landmark deal to put Theranos wellness centers in Walgreens stores, they knew their machines couldn't deliver. So, they secretly bought commercially available blood testing equipment from companies like Siemens, modified them to work with the tiny, diluted samples from finger pricks, a scientifically dubious practice, and ran most of the tests on these third-party machines. The public saw the futuristic Theranos branding, believing their blood was being analyzed by the miraculous Edison, while behind a wall, their samples were being processed on standard, conventional equipment. The first tremors of doubt came not from Wall Street, but from the conscience of a few brave insiders. A brilliant chemist and chief scientist at the company, Ian Gibbons, tried to warn Holmes that the technology was not ready and was being dangerously misrepresented. He was marginalized and threatened, and in the face of unbearable pressure, he tragically took his own life. Then a new voice emerged. John Carreyrou, an investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal, received a tip from a medical expert who was deeply skeptical of Theranos' claims. Carreyrou began digging, a process that felt more like espionage than journalism. He found a network of former employees, terrified but willing to speak anonymously. His most crucial source became Tyler Schultz, a young employee who happened to be the grandson of board member George Schultz. Tyler had witnessed the fraud firsthand, the failed tests, the manipulated data, and tried to raise the alarm, only to be dismissed by his own grandfather, who was completely captivated by Holmes's charisma. When Holmes learned of Carreyrou's investigation, she unleashed the full force of her power. She and Balwani held intimidating all-hands meetings, dispatched their lawyers to threaten Carreyrou and his sources, and tried to leverage their powerful board members to kill the story. George Schultz himself tried to pressure his grandson into silence, but Carreyrou and his sources held firm. In October 2015, the Wall Street Journal published Carreyrou's first explosive article, revealing the truth about the faulty technology and the secret use of conventional machines. The story pierced the myth of Theranos. The fallout was immediate and devastating. Regulators from the FDA and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services launched their own investigations, which confirmed Carreyrou's reporting and uncovered widespread failures and safety violations. Walgreens sued, partnerships evaporated, and the $9 billion valuation vanished into thin air. The blood unicorn was revealed to be a phantom. Elizabeth Holmes was not a visionary, she was the architect of a massive, multi-year fraud. She and Balwani were indicted on federal charges of defrauding investors, doctors, and patients. The company that had promised to save lives had, in fact, endangered them, all while being propped up by a powerful story that Silicon Valley and the world had desperately wanted to believe. In the late 1990s, Dennis Kozlowski was the embodiment of corporate machismo. As the CEO of Tyco International, he was a Wall Street darling, a man celebrated for his ferocious, relentless appetite for acquisitions. Tyco wasn't a glamorous tech company or a storied financial institution. It was a sprawling, unsexy conglomerate that made everything from ADT security systems and fire sprinklers to undersea fiber optic cable. But under Kozlowski, the mundane was made magnificent through sheer, brutal growth. He was Deal a Day Dennis, and investors loved him for it. Every acquisition sent Tyco's stock price soaring, creating a perception of unstoppable momentum and brilliant leadership. Kozlowski cultivated an image of a tough, no-nonsense executive. He kept Tyco's headquarters in a modest building in Exeter, New Hampshire, far from the prying eyes of New York, to project a sense of fiscal prudence. He claimed he didn't believe in corporate jets or fancy perks, a narrative that played well with shareholders. The company's success seemed built on this blue-collar work ethic, a stark contrast to the dot-com excesses of the era. This public image, however, was a carefully constructed fiction. Behind the facade of a frugal New England conglomerate, Dennis Kozlowski was treating Tyco's treasury as his own personal bank account, funding a lifestyle of such cartoonish opulence it bordered on the surreal. The true headquarters of his empire was not in New Hampshire, but in a lavish $30 million duplex on Fifth Avenue in New York City, which he had the company buy for him. The mechanism for his theft was deceptively simple. Tyco had a key employee loan (KL) program designed to help executives pay taxes on their vested stock options. Kozlowski and his chief financial officer, Mark Schwartz, twisted this program into a personal slush fund. They granted themselves hundreds of millions of dollars in loans with no oversight, then simply had the company forgive the debt, effectively turning the loans into tax-free gifts. They also awarded themselves hundreds of millions in unauthorized bonuses, dipping into the corporate coffers whenever they wished. It wasn't a complex accounting fraud. It was brazen, old-fashioned looting hidden in plain sight within the company's vast and convoluted bureaucracy. The money funded a fantasy life. Kozlowski owned mansions in Florida and Nantucket, a mega yacht, and a professional sailing team. His New York apartment was a monument to excess, decorated with over $13 million worth of art, including masterpieces by Monet and Renoir. The furnishings were legendary in their extravagance. A $6,000 shower curtain, a $15,000 dog-shaped umbrella stand, and a $2,200 wastebasket. The scheme began to unravel from a completely unexpected direction. It wasn't an auditor or a whistleblower who raised the alarm, but an art dealer. In 2002, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, led by the venerable Robert Morgenthau, was conducting a citywide crackdown on sales tax evasion by wealthy art collectors. An informant mentioned that Dennis Kozlowski had purchased millions in fine art but seemed to have avoided paying New York's substantial sales tax. Investigators dug into the transactions. They found that Kozlowski had the paintings delivered to his New York apartment, but the shipping invoices were faked to show they were sent to Tyco's office in New Hampshire, a state with no sales tax. This tax dodge, designed to save him about $1 million, was the thread that would unravel a multi-hundred-million-dollar corporate fraud. The tax inquiry gave prosecutors the legal authority to subpoena his personal and corporate financial records. As they pored over the documents, investigators were stunned by what they found. The sheer volume of money flowing from Tyco directly to Kozlowski was staggering. They uncovered the forgiven loans, the secret bonuses, and the corporate funds used for his personal expenses. The most infamous example, which would become the symbol of his greed, was a $2 million 40th birthday party he threw for his wife, Karen, on the Italian island of Sardinia. The Roman-themed bacchanal featured gladiators, chariots, and an ice sculpture of Michelangelo's David that dispensed vodka from its anatomy. Kozlowski had Tyco pay for half of the party, justifying it as a corporate event. In June 2002, just as he was about to finalize another massive deal to break up the company, Kozlowski was indicted for sales tax evasion. 3 months later, a far more serious indictment came down, charging him and Schwartz with grand larceny and enterprise corruption. The details of their spending became front-page news, shocking a public already reeling from the Enron and WorldCom scandals. The trial was a spectacle, laying bare the profound disconnect between the executive suite and reality. Kozlowski's defense was that the board knew about and had implicitly approved his compensation and expenses. But the evidence of systemic theft was overwhelming. After an initial mistrial, a second jury found both men guilty. Dennis Kozlowski, the king of the deal, was sentenced to prison, his name forever synonymous not with corporate growth, but with breathtaking personal greed. In almost every Italian kitchen, from the bustling streets of Milan to the quiet villages of Sicily, the Parmalat brand was a symbol of home. It was the milk children drank for breakfast, the yogurt in their lunch, the cookies for their afternoon snack. Parmalat was more than a company, it was a national institution, a testament to Italian industrial prowess. At its head was the dignified patriarch, Callisto Tanzi, a man who had built his family's small hem business into a global food empire. He was revered as a captain of industry, a devout Catholic who embodied the values of family, hard work, and tradition. By the early 2000s, Parmalat was a behemoth, operating in over 30 countries. It sponsored ski teams and Formula One cars, its logo a familiar mark of quality and success. The company's financial reports, audited by prestigious firms, painted a picture of robust health. Its balance sheet was anchored by a particularly impressive asset, a cash reserve of nearly €4 billion, held in an account at Bank of America in New York by a Caribbean subsidiary named Bonlat Financing Corporation. This massive cash pile was the company's fortress, a guarantee of its stability that reassured investors and allowed it to borrow money easily on the international markets. This fortress, however, was a mirage. Parmalat was rotting from the inside. Tanzi's ambition had outpaced his business acumen. A series of disastrous acquisitions, particularly in Latin America, and a failed attempt to buy a television network had saddled the company with colossal debts. Instead of admitting these failures, Tanzi and a small circle of loyal executives, led by his brilliant and volatile CFO, Fausto Tana, chose to conceal them. They began a decade-long campaign of deception, creating a labyrinth of offshore shell companies to hide debt and invent assets. The linchpin of the entire fraud was the Bonlat account. It was the single most important number on their balance sheet, the proof of their solvency. The problem was the account and the 4 billion euros within it did not exist. It was a complete fabrication, the crown jewel in a kingdom of lies. For years the deception held. The company's longtime auditor was complicit, signing off on the books without independently verifying the offshore assets. But when a new law forced Italian companies to rotate auditors, Parmalat had to bring in a new firm, Deloitte. At the same time, the company was struggling to make a payment on a 150 million euro bond. Investors began asking pointed questions. If you have 4 billion euros in the bank, why is it so hard to pay a 150 million euro debt? The pressure mounted. The new auditors and concerned bankers demanded irrefutable proof of the Bonlat account. In a tense meeting in late 2003, Fausto Tana produced the smoking gun. A formal letter on what appeared to be Bank of America letterhead, signed by a bank official, confirming that Bonlat held precisely 3,950,563,121 euros in its account as of March 6 of that year. It was the proof everyone had been waiting for. But the bankers at Bank of America's Milan office were not satisfied. Standard procedure required them to verify the document directly with their New York headquarters. They sent a query across the Atlantic. The request was simple. Can you confirm the authenticity of this letter and the existence of this account? The reply came back swiftly. It was a short, devastating message that would bring one of Europe's largest companies to its knees. The official who had supposedly signed the letter did not exist. His signature was a forgery. The account did not exist. The letter itself was a crude fake, created by Tana's team on a scanner and a color printer in their office in Collecchio, Italy. The news detonated within the highest echelons of European finance. The company's fortress was a phantom. The foundation of Parmalat's balance sheet was nothing more than a poorly forged document. On December 19, 2003, the company publicly admitted the account was fake. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Trading in Parmalat stock was suspended. It was now worthless. The company collapsed into bankruptcy, revealing a 14 billion euro hole in its accounts, a figure more than 7 times what the company had initially claimed. It was, at the time, the largest bankruptcy in European history, a scandal that would forever be known as Europe's Enron. Callisto Tanzi, the respected patriarch, was arrested. The investigation uncovered the breathtaking scale of the fraud he had overseen for over a decade. The man who had built an empire on milk had sustained it with lies, choosing to construct an elaborate financial mirage rather than admit his failures. The wholesome brand that had graced millions of Italian tables was now a permanent symbol of corporate deceit. The black leather briefcase landed on the hood of a maroon Opel sedan with a soft thud, and in that moment, inside a dim Detroit parking garage, General Motors lost 7 years of its most coveted cost-cutting secrets. José Ignacio López de Arriortua, GM's legendary purchasing chief, had just resigned to join Volkswagen in Germany. The news ricocheted through Detroit's Renaissance Center like a ricocheting pinball. The man who had squeezed billions from suppliers was jumping to a rival. Taking with him, people whispered, the very blueprints of GM's future. For a decade, Lopez had wielded spreadsheets like sabers, slashing parts prices, streamlining factories, earning the nickname Lopez the Terrible among vendors. Yet his genius hid a restless impatience. He wanted a seat on GM's board, and when that door stayed shut, VW CEO Ferdinand Piëch offered him something better. A board seat in Wolfsburg, carte blanche to reinvent the entire purchasing division, and it seemed rockstar status in Europe. Lopez's farewell party was strangely cordial. Handshakes, champagne, a tasteful sheep cake, while security badges still dangled from his belt. No one noticed the extra briefcase he carried to his car that night. Inside lay binders titled Global Sourcing 1994 to 2001, Vendor Scorecards, and a spiral notebook covered in his own angular handwriting, Project Saturn Cost Targets. Keep private. The next morning, GM's Vice President of Legal, Lewis Hughes, received an anonymous fax. It showed a photocopied page from one of those binders, complete with proprietary pricing algorithms. Scrawled across the bottom were 3 words: "He took everything." Hughes phoned GM security, who combed badge logs and surveillance tapes. Footage revealed Lopez wheeling 2 suitcases out at 10:13 p.m., one more than he had wheeled in. While corporate investigators traced the missing documents, Lopez was already in Wolfsburg, striding through glass corridors as if he had lived there forever. He promised Peach he could shave $1,000 off the cost of every future golf and polo by imposing the same ruthless supplier regime he had pioneered in Detroit. When his new lieutenants asked how, he tapped a folder marked Confidential, USA, and smiled thinly. Back in Michigan, GM summoned the FBI. Special Agent Don Shands, a quiet man with rimless glasses, listened as engineers described the purloined binders. He understood their value immediately. The pages outlined which factories would close, which suppliers were vulnerable, and exactly how low GM believed each component price could go. If Volkswagen wielded those figures, it could underbid GM worldwide for years. The Bureau opened a file under the Economic Espionage Act, passed just 3 years earlier, and in coordination with German prosecutors secured a raid warrant. One gray dawn in August 1993, Lower Saxony police swept through Lopez's Wolfsburg office. Desks were searched, cabinets unlocked, and, crucially, a safe behind a framed abstract painting cracked open. Inside lay dozens of files bearing GM logos. Lopez stood rigid, arms folded, insisting that the material was personal study notes. Officers cataloged every page, sealed them in tamper-evident bags, and carried them out under the curious eyes of VW staff. The story erupted. German tabloids called it Operation Documents. American papers labeled Lopez a James Bond villain with a spreadsheet instead of a pistol. Peach, unflappable in public, privately fumed. He argued the police had overreached, that Lopez carried only general knowledge gathered during his GM tenure. But optical charm-marked pages matched the missing binders. There was no plausible deniability. GM filed a civil lawsuit in a U.S. federal court, alleging theft of trade secrets and racketeering. The complaint spanned 160 pages, each more damning than the last. Volkswagen's share price dipped. Suppliers wondered whether to freeze bids. The German government, partial owner of VW, braced for diplomatic friction. As depositions loomed, Lopez retreated from public view, commuting between lawyers' offices in Munich and a secluded farmhouse in the Basque Country. There, among rolling hills, he pored over transcripts, rehearsing answers that walked the knife edge between bravado and perjury. He insisted he had carried the files only to benchmark VW's costs. He intended to return or destroy them once he had internalized the lessons. The explanation impressed no one. 2 years dragged on. At one mediation session in Detroit, GM's chief counsel slid a photo across the polished mahogany table. Lopez's safe, its door ajar, GM binders stacked neatly inside. Peach inhaled sharply, then whispered to advisors. Hours later, a tentative settlement emerged. VW would pay GM $100 million, agree to purchase $1 billion in parts from GM suppliers over 7 years, and issue a joint statement condemning misunderstandings that encouraged the transfer of sensitive materials. Lopez quietly would resign for personal reasons. When the announcement hit the wires on New Year's Eve 1996, analysts called it the costliest briefcase in automotive history. GM hailed the agreement as a warning shot to anyone plotting to walk away with proprietary data. VW spun it as a strategic sourcing partnership that benefited both companies. Yet the shadows of espionage clung to Wolfsburg's corridors long after the checks cleared. Lopez never faced criminal conviction. German prosecutors eventually closed their case, but his reputation fractured. He spent his final industry years consulting for smaller suppliers, his brilliance still respected, his methods forever suspect. In training videos, GM now shows new managers a grainy still of Lopez wheeling that extra suitcase out of the parking garage. Remember, the narrator intones over a faint hum of fluorescent lights, betrayal seldom looks like a spy in a trench coat. Often it looks like a trusted colleague saying a polite goodbye, while a briefcase filled with your future rests casually at his side. And somewhere in Wolfsburg's archives, a scuffed leather case gathers dust, a silent monument to how one night's quiet thud can echo through 2 continents, shake boardrooms, and remind every corporation that nothing is more fragile than the trust that guards its deepest secrets. In Houston, at the dawn of the new millennium, the Enron building was a temple to the future. Gleaming and monumental, it was the headquarters of a company that had transcended its humble origins as a natural gas pipeline operator to become a symbol of the new economy. Enron didn't just sell energy, it traded it. It created markets for everything from electricity and natural gas to broadband capacity and weather derivatives. At its helm were men seen as prophets of this new age: Kenneth Lay, the grandfatherly chairman with deep political connections, and Jeffrey Skilling, the brilliant, fiercely aggressive CEO who believed that with enough intellectual firepower, any risk could be managed and any profit realized. To the outside world, Enron was an unstoppable force. Its revenues and stock price soared relentlessly upward, defying gravity and market logic. It was named America's most innovative company by Fortune magazine for 6 years running. Its secret weapon was mark-to-market accounting, a method that allowed it to book the estimated future profits from a long-term deal the moment the contract was signed. A 20-year energy contract could be logged as $1 billion profit today, flooding the books with spectacular, if hypothetical, earnings. This created an immense pressure to do deals, any deals, to keep feeding the beast and satisfying Wall Street's insatiable hunger for growth. But many of these deals, particularly the company's ventures into international markets and new technologies like video on demand, were spectacular failures. They were bleeding billions, not making them. This is where the true dark genius of Enron's financial architecture came into play. The architect of this shadow world was the chief financial officer, Andrew Fastow, a man who saw the arcane rules of accounting not as constraints, but as a playground. To hide the company's hemorrhaging debt and failing assets, Fastow created a bewildering maze of off-balance sheet entities known as special purpose entities, SPEs. These were shell companies given cryptic, often self-aggrandizing names like LJM, for the first initials of his wife and 2 sons, and Chuko, after Chewbacca from Star Wars. Enron would sell its toxic assets and bad debts to these SPEs. This moved the losses off Enron's main books, making the company appear far healthier and more profitable than it actually was. It was a brilliant and deeply fraudulent illusion. Enron was essentially hiding its own garbage in a complex web of partnerships that it secretly controlled. To make matters worse, Fastow himself was running these partnerships, personally enriching himself with tens of millions in management fees, a staggering conflict of interest that was approved by the board. The entire structure was a house of cards built on a foundation of Enron's own soaring stock price. If the stock ever faltered, the SPEs would collapse, and the mountains of hidden debt would come roaring back home. The first serious cracks appeared not on a trading floor, but in an internal memo. In the summer of 2001, a vice president named Sharon Watkins, a straight-talking accountant, discovered the gaping holes in the company's books. She wrote a now-famous anonymous letter to Ken Lay, warning him that the company was an elaborate accounting hoax and was likely to implode in a wave of accounting scandals. Lay met with her, promised a full investigation, and then had the company's own law firm, the firm that had approved the SPEs in the first place, conduct a cursory review that found no major issues. Watkins's warning was buried, but the whispers were growing louder. Reporters at the Wall Street Journal were beginning to scrutinize Fastow's strange partnerships. Then, in August 2001, in a move that shocked Wall Street, Jeff Skilling abruptly resigned as CEO after only 6 months, citing personal reasons. His departure spooked investors, and the stock began to slide. The slide quickly became an avalanche. As the stock price fell, the fragile SPEs began to unravel, just as Watkins had predicted. The hidden debt became impossible to contain. In October 2001, Enron stunned the world by announcing a third-quarter loss of over $600 million and a massive $1.2 billion reduction in shareholder equity, admitting for the first time that Fastow's partnerships had gone sour. The confession shattered the company's credibility. The SEC launched a formal investigation. The stock plunged into a death spiral. Within weeks, the company that had been the 7th largest in America was worthless. On December 2, 2001, Enron filed for bankruptcy. The smartest guys in the room were exposed as architects of one of the most audacious corporate frauds in history. Thousands of employees lost their jobs and life savings, which had been locked up in now worthless Enron stock. The company's name became a byword for corporate greed and corruption, a lasting monument to the idea that no amount of innovation can hide a rotten core. In the mid-1990s, the world of mineral exploration was a high-stakes game of patience and luck, played out in the planet's most remote corners. From this rough-and-tumble world emerged a story so fantastic it seemed ripped from a boy's adventure novel. It was the story of Bre-X Minerals, a tiny, struggling Canadian penny stock company, and its improbable discovery in the dense, steamy jungles of Borneo, Indonesia. At its center were three men: David Walsh, a charming and persuasive stock promoter from Calgary, John Felderhoff, a respected exploration geologist, and Michael de Guzman, the Filipino project manager on the ground, the man with his hands in the dirt. The project was located in a place called Busong, a remote area with no infrastructure, where stories of giant gold deposits had lured and defeated prospectors for decades. In 1993, de Guzman began drilling. Soon, his core samples started telling an incredible tale. The crushed rock, sent for analysis, showed traces of gold. Then, more than traces, they showed significant, commercially viable concentrations. The reports sent back to the Calgary office grew more and more exciting. Walsh, a master storyteller, began weaving this data into a compelling narrative for investors. The news started as a whisper on the fringe stock exchanges but quickly grew into a roar. Bre-X's stock, once trading for mere pennies, began to climb. With each new press release announcing ever richer drill results, the price multiplied. Small-time investors, teachers, firefighters, and retirees across Canada and beyond piled in, betting their life savings on this jungle miracle. The geologists, Felderhoff and de Guzman, began making astonishing estimates. The Busong site didn't just contain gold, it contained at least 30 million ounces, then 70 million. Some whispered the final tally could top 200 million ounces, which would make it the single largest and richest gold deposit ever discovered in human history. Bre-X became a corporate titan, its market capitalization soaring to over $6 billion. David Walsh, once a bankrupt promoter, was now a billionaire, a folk hero who was making ordinary people rich. The company was notoriously secretive, keeping its data and core samples under tight control, which only added to the mystique. They were protecting the find of the century. But the sheer scale of the claim began to attract not just investors, but powerful predators. Major global mining corporations wanted a piece of the action. So did the corrupt and powerful regime of Indonesia's President Suharto. The government, seeing a national treasure being controlled by a small Canadian firm, stepped in and forced Bre-X into a partnership. After a series of intense negotiations, they were compelled to join forces with Freeport-McMoRan, a massive and highly respected American mining company. Freeport would be the senior partner, tasked with developing the mine. But first, they had to do their own due diligence, which meant conducting their own drilling to verify Bre-X's incredible claims. In March 1997, as Freeport's team was setting up its rigs in Busong, the story took a dark and sudden turn. Michael de Guzman, the chief geologist and the architect of the discovery, boarded a helicopter to fly to the site. He never arrived. During the flight, he fell from the helicopter into the dense jungle thousands of feet below. His body, found days later, was badly decomposed and reportedly ravaged by wild animals. His death was officially ruled a suicide. He had left behind several notes, detailing his failing health and marital problems. But the timing was impossibly suspicious. He was the one man who knew the ground truth of Busong better than anyone. Weeks later, the ground truth was revealed. Freeport-McMoRan released the results of its own drilling. Their core samples, drilled just feet away from Bre-X's holes, showed nothing. No significant gold mineralization. The deposit wasn't just smaller than claimed, it was non-existent. In a final, devastating test, Freeport's labs analyzed some of Bre-X's original gold-rich samples under a microscope. They made a stunning discovery. The gold flakes in the samples were rounded, with soft edges, the distinct characteristic of alluvial gold, panned from a riverbed. The gold in a hard rock volcanic deposit, as Busong was claimed to be, would have been sharp and crystalline. The fraud was revealed in all its low-tech audacity. There was no vast underground treasure. Michael de Guzman, or someone under his direction, had been systematically salting the samples for years. He had been taking worthless crushed rock from the drill cores and mixing in gold dust, likely purchased from local panners for a few $1,000s. The entire multi-billion-dollar enterprise was built on this simple, ancient deception. The news hit the market like a meteor. Briek's stock collapsed to zero in minutes, wiping out fortunes and destroying the savings of thousands of investors. The jungle of gold was a fraud. David Walsh maintained his innocence, claiming he too was a victim. John Felderhoff was charged with insider trading but was eventually acquitted. And Michael de Guzman, the only man who knew the full story, was dead. The great adventure had ended, leaving behind a crater of ruin and a legendary cautionary tale of how easily the dazzling promise of a golden future can be built on nothing more than a handful of dust. In the heart of Mississippi, far from the polished canyons of Wall Street, Bernie Ebbers built an empire. He wasn't a slick financier or a tech prodigy. He was a former basketball coach and motel owner with a folksy charm and a reputation for down-to-earth simplicity. He was the telecom cowboy, famous for his blue jeans, cowboy boots, and his company WorldCom. Through a breathtakingly aggressive series of acquisitions in the 1990s, he had transformed a small long-distance reseller into the second-largest telecommunications company in the United States, a Goliath that handled a huge portion of the world's internet traffic. WorldCom was the ultimate outsider success story. It was headquartered not in New York, but in the quiet town of Clinton, Mississippi. Its corporate culture mirrored its CEO, lean, aggressive, and obsessed with growth. The company's stock was a Wall Street darling, its relentless upward climb fueled by an unwavering belief in Ebbers' vision. The mantra was simple: keep growing, keep acquiring, and hit the numbers that analysts demanded each quarter. 4 years, the formula worked like magic, making Ebbers and his investors fabulously wealthy. Then, in 2000, the magic stopped. The dot-com bubble burst, and the once booming telecom sector fell off a cliff. The demand for internet bandwidth and phone services that had fueled WorldCom's spectacular rise suddenly evaporated. The company's revenue growth stalled, then began to decline. For a company whose entire identity and stock value were built on the promise of perpetual expansion, this was a catastrophe. The pressure to hit the numbers, to maintain the illusion of success, became unbearable. Faced with this reality, Bernie Ebbers and his star chief financial officer, Scott Sullivan, made a fateful choice. Instead of revealing their struggles to Wall Street, they decided to rewrite reality itself. They embarked on one of the largest and most brazen accounting frauds in history, not through complex financial engineering, but through a lie of rudimentary, almost childish simplicity. The deception started small. They began by dipping into the company's accounting reserves, money set aside for anticipated future expenses. They simply moved these funds into the revenue column, artificially inflating their earnings to meet Wall Street's expectations. But these cookie jars were soon empty, and the company's financial performance was getting worse. They needed a bigger trick. They found it in the company's single largest expense, line costs. These were the billions of dollars WorldCom paid to other telecom carriers to lease access to their networks. These were fundamental day-to-day operating expenses, like an electric bill or employee salaries. In a stunning breach of basic accounting principles, Sullivan ordered his subordinates to start reclassifying these expenses. They began booking these everyday bills as capital expenditures, treating them as if they were long-term investments, like building a new data center or laying fiber optic cable. This simple act of accounting alchemy was miraculous. An expense immediately reduces a company's profits. A capital investment, however, is recorded as an asset and its cost is spread out over many years. By capitalizing billions in line costs, WorldCom instantly erased them from the income statement. Massive losses were transformed with a few keystrokes into spectacular profits. This fraud was carried out in secret by a small group of accountants, who were pressured into making the fraudulent entries, often in the dead of night. But deep within WorldCom's own headquarters, a quiet rebellion was brewing. Cynthia Cooper, the company's head of internal audit, was a loyal, by-the-book professional. In the spring of 2002, she was approached by a concerned employee from the finance department who hinted at major irregularities. Cooper's own team had also been stonewalled by the finance department when trying to conduct routine audits. Her suspicions piqued, she decided to investigate. What followed was an act of quiet, corporate courage. Knowing she was challenging the most powerful executives in the company, Cooper and her small team began working in secret, often late at night, to avoid detection. They burrowed deep into the company's centralized accounting system, a place they had previously been denied access to. What they found made their blood run cold. There were massive, multi-million-dollar journal entries that made no sense, backed by no documentation. They saw the line costs being magically transformed into assets. The scale of it was staggering, billions of dollars in fraudulent entries. Cooper knew she was holding a grenade. She took her findings to the company's chief financial officer, Scott Sullivan. He tried to intimidate her, telling her she was wrong and to drop the investigation. When she persisted, he condescendingly tried to explain it away. Undeterred, Cooper bypassed him and took her meticulously documented evidence directly to the head of the board's audit committee. The board was stunned. Faced with irrefutable proof from their own internal auditor, they were forced to act. They confronted Sullivan, who, after a feeble attempt at denial, confessed. On June 25, 2002, the world learned the truth. WorldCom announced it had improperly accounted for $3.8 billion in expenses, a number that would eventually swell to over $11 billion. The company collapsed almost overnight, filing for what was, at the time, the largest bankruptcy in U.S. history. Bernie Ebbers, the telecom cowboy, was forced out and later convicted of fraud and conspiracy, his empire reduced to a symbol of corporate hubris. The fraud was not uncovered by the SEC or Wall Street analysts, but by a small team of internal employees who chose to follow their conscience rather than their orders, proving that sometimes the deepest truths are found by those brave enough to turn on the lights in their own house. In the New York tri-state area of the 1970s and 80s, his voice was an inescapable part of the background radiation of daily life. It screamed from radios and blared from late-night television, a frantic machine gun delivery promising deals so good they could only be described one way: Crazy Eddie. His prices are unsettling. The commercials were iconic, a masterpiece of low-budget, high-energy advertising that made Crazy Eddie the go-to destination for electronics. The business seemed to be a chaotic, thriving bazaar, a family-run empire built on volume, hustle, and rock-bottom prices. At the center of it all was Eddie Anter, a tough, charismatic retailer from Brooklyn. He, along with his father and cousins, cultivated an image as retail mavericks, outsmarting the stuffy department stores and giving the customer a deal. The company's growth was explosive. From a single store, it grew into a regional powerhouse. In 1984, Eddie took the company public. Wall Street fell in love with the story. Here was a company with incredible, consistent sales growth, a beloved brand, and a seemingly bulletproof business model. The stock soared, making the Anter family spectacularly wealthy and cementing Eddie's status as a retail genius. But the entire empire was built on a foundation of lies, a fraud that evolved in two distinct phases. The first phase, before the company went public, was a classic tax evasion scheme. The Anters were systematically skimming cash right out of the registers. Before sales were logged, a family member would pocket a portion of the cash, which was then smuggled out of the country. For years, they stole millions, living lavishly on untaxed profits. Their true financial performance was a closely guarded family secret. Then came the IPO. Suddenly, the goal flipped. Before, they wanted to make the company look less profitable to avoid taxes. Now, as a public company, they needed to show ever-increasing, spectacular growth to keep the stock price climbing. And so, they used their years of criminal expertise to run the fraud in reverse. This was Phase 2, a massive securities fraud designed to dupe Wall Street. Their methods were brazen. To inflate sales figures, they laundered their previously skimmed cash back into the company. In a scheme they called the Panama Pump, they would deposit their hidden millions into Panamanian and Israeli bank accounts, then wire the money back to Crazy Eddie, claiming it was revenue. They also engaged in blatant inventory fraud. They would ship products from one store to another just ahead of the auditors, allowing the same inventory to be counted multiple times. They would book warranty returns as new stock. They even included empty boxes and broken equipment in their inventory counts. The company's reported growth wasn't just exaggerated, it was pure fiction manufactured by the same family that ran the commercials. The beginning of the end came not from an investigator, but from a corporate raider. A rival firm, smelling blood in the water or perhaps just an undervalued asset, launched a hostile takeover bid in 1987. This triggered a period of intense scrutiny. More importantly, it shattered the fragile loyalty of the Anter clan. The family, which had been united in crime, began to feud over control of the company. Eddie fired his own father. Cousins turned on cousins. When the new management finally took control of Crazy Eddie after the takeover, they walked into a house of horrors. They quickly discovered a massive hole in the company's books. The inventory they had supposedly acquired was short by more than $65 million. The sales figures were a fantasy. The company was a hollowed-out shell. The SEC launched a formal investigation, and the full scope of the fraud was laid bare. The company collapsed into bankruptcy, its iconic name forever tarnished. Eddie Anter, seeing the writing on the wall, fled the country, becoming an international fugitive. He was eventually captured in Israel, extradited to the US, and convicted of racketeering and fraud. The story of Crazy Eddie became a legendary cautionary tale, a reminder that the loudest, most frantic promises are often the most deceptive, and that the company's famous slogan was true in a way no customer could have ever imagined. The wafer glowed a deep, impossible violet as the extreme ultraviolet beam swept across it, and in that fragile moment, inside a hermetically sealed clean room near San Jose, the future of every advanced microchip in the world flickered on a single sliver of silicon. SML, the Dutch firm that ruled lithography, had bought its Bay Area software arm, Brian Technologies. Precisely so moments like this could unfold in America as well as Eindhoven. The engineers in bunny suits called their brainchild Twinskin, a machine capable of etching features smaller than a coronavirus onto silicon wafers. What almost no one knew was that Brian's pattern correction software, codenamed Twilight, was the real magic dust. Without it, the $150 million machines were glorified flashlights. Shin Zhongfu understood that better than anyone. A quiet algorithm specialist with a doctorate from Berkeley, Shin had spent 8 years perfecting the equations that let Twilight anticipate how light would ripple through each mask layer and adjust the beam in real time. Patent citations listed his name over 100 times. Yet his promotion ladder froze. Colleagues said he lacked leadership sparkle. At home, Shin binged news about China's push for semiconductor independence. Headlines spoke of government grants, national pride, and a shortage of top-tier lithography know-how. Shin felt a tug, half patriotism, half wounded ego. On a rainy December Friday, he slipped a portable SSD the size of a matchbox into his badge pouch. Brian's firewall flagged no anomalies. Shin's credentials sat atop the access hierarchy. He executed a silent script that swept the Twilight repository, simulation kernels, masked data preprocessors, even a confidential future node roadmap stretching to the Angstrom era. 2 hours later, the progress bar winked complete. Shin encrypted the trove and headed for the parking lot, where an ordinary Honda Civic waited beneath sodium lamps humming like distant bees. The plan was elegantly crooked. Shin had co-founded a shell company, Xdale, with 2 former classmates in an office park outside Palo Alto. Publicly, they offered optics consulting. Privately, they pitched venture funds on a technology that could skip a decade of R&D. The pitch deck promised a software suite called Crystal Clear that just happened to mirror Twilight feature for feature. Investors nodded. One agreed to wire an initial $6 million once a demo proved viable. Shin began nights and weekend sprints, porting Twilight's code into Crystal Clear with cosmetic changes. Variable names altered, comments stripped, algorithms left intact. Inside ASML, anomaly lights finally flickered. Security engineer Laura Kiesling noticed that a rarely used export utility had logged 2 terabytes of outbound traffic in one weekend. She pulled badge logs. Shin swipe at 2:07 a.m., exit at 4:41 a.m. She flagged it, but because Shin still worked on high-level tasks, management chalked it up to overtime. Kiesling wasn't satisfied. She installed a canary file deep inside the repository, a harmless decoy documenting a fictitious breakthrough called OptiPhase. If that file ever surfaced outside, she would know. 3 months later, an industry blogger covering a startup conference posted screenshots of Crystal Clear's UI. Zooming into the corner of one slide, Kiesling saw a file tree. One folder read OptiPhase notes. Her pulse thudded. She printed the screenshot, walked straight to the legal floor, and set it on the general counsel's desk. Within a week, ASML subpoenaed the startup's records and called the FBI. Special Agent Diego Serrano, freshly reassigned from cyber fraud, met Kiesling in a glass-walled conference room that smelled of burnt coffee and panic. She laid out a timeline, code checkout logs, badge swipes, and the incriminating screenshot. Serrano won a sealed warrant to image Stahl's servers. At dawn on a Tuesday, agents escorted Shin from his cubicle while digital forensics teams cloned drives. Shin's co-founder stared, pale, as the machines they'd leased on a bootstrap budget spewed gigabytes into evidence bags. The indictment that followed spanned 17 counts of theft of trade secrets. Prosecutors argued that Crystal Clear was functionally identical to Twilight, down to duplicated typos and error messages. Shin's defense painted him as an underappreciated engineer merely leveraging open knowledge. A witness for the prosecution displayed side-by-side code blocks differing only in whitespace. Jurors hardly needed the explanation. In November 2018, a federal jury found Stahl liable for $223 million in damages, small by semiconductor plant standards, colossal for a fledgling startup. Shin himself faced criminal sentencing. When the judge asked why he'd done it, Shin spoke in steady, almost rueful English. "I thought the world needed this technology faster, and I thought I deserved to lead it." He received 16 months and deportation upon release. ASML breathed, reinstated bonuses frozen during the investigation, and instituted draconian safeguards. Any code download over 50 megabytes triggered dual approval. Laptops required physical YubiKeys that logged geographic anomalies. In Eindhoven, a new sign appeared above the cleanroom entrance. "Light etches atoms, people etch trust." Yet the damage rippled. Chinese venture capital, once eager to bankroll gray tech transfers, grew skittish. U.S. lawmakers cited the XTL case while tightening export controls on EUV equipment. Recruiters found that some top engineers now refused offers from startups, fearing guilt by association. Every orientation at ASML's California site ends with a still photo. A lone Civic beneath orange sodium lamps, trunk partly open. The narrator's voice is almost tender. "A single Matchbox drive can carry the blueprint for the next decade, but it can also carry every dream you have for that decade out the door." Shin works today at a city college in Guangzhou teaching basic optics, earning enough to pay rent but never enough to fund grand ambitions. Students say he still speaks of lithography with near religious awe, then falls silent, gazing at the chalk dust swirling through fluorescent light like motes in a vacuum chamber, remembering the night violet beams danced on a wafer while his download bar marched past 99%. And somewhere in Silicon Valley, an engineer finishing a late shift checks the badges, glances at the cameras, and thinks again before exporting tomorrow's miracle onto anything smaller than trust itself. The countdown clock read T12 hours when a plain manila folder changed the balance of America's space launch industry and sent two aerospace giants into a legal tailspin. Inside the folder lay photocopies of Lockheed Martin's most guarded pricing tables for the Titan IV rocket. Numbers so sensitive they were printed only once a quarter, stored in a cipher-locked safe, and shown to executives in a windowless vault nicknamed the Bunker. Yet on a humid June afternoon in 1998, the papers rode quietly in the briefcase of Kenneth Branch, a mid-level engineer who had just resigned from Lockheed to join its arch-rival, Boeing. Branch was genial, forgettable, the sort of man who knew every underdesk cable in the launch control center but never spoke above a murmur. When he gave 2 weeks' notice, colleagues signed a Hallmark card and assumed he was chasing a raise. No one watched as he packed the folder between spiral notebooks and a coffee-stained flight dynamics manual. TSA still used metal detectors, not document checks, so the secrets flew with him from Cape Canaveral to Boeing's Delta launch offices in Huntington Beach, California. Boeing's leadership was desperate. The Pentagon had announced the Evolved Expendable Launch Vehicle (ELV) program, an $18 billion, decade-long contract to ferry military satellites into orbit. Winning required a bid so lean it squeezed profit to the bone, and analysts whispered that Lockheed's Titan line was the favorite. When Branch walked into a strategy meeting, set the folder on the mahogany table and said, "I brought something that might help us sharpen our pencil," nobody asked many questions. Inside were charts that spelled out Lockheed's cost per launch pad, labor hours, contingency padding, and espionage gold mine. Boeing's proposal team cross-referenced each data point, trimming just enough off its own Delta IV budget to undercut Titan by a hairbreadth. Months later, the Air Force awarded Boeing 21 of the first 28 ELV missions. Celebratory champagne sprayed in Seattle boardrooms. Branch received a discreet $10,000 bonus and a corner cubicle overlooking the Pacific haze. Lockheed smelled trouble. Post-award debriefs hinted that Boeing had hit target prices with uncanny precision. Rumors floated that someone had walked the playbook across the street. Lockheed's security director, retired FBI agent Paul Gentile, launched an internal audit. He found that a master copy of the pricing tables, normally logged out only under dual signature, was missing on the day Branch cleaned out his desk. Gentile pulled visitor logs, badge swipes, and shredding receipts, then phoned the Department of Defense hotline. The case landed on the desk of Special Agent Edward Bayer in the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. Bayer, lean and soft-spoken, had tracked cargo smugglers in Turkey. A missing folder sounded tame, but two details hooked him: national security payloads and an $18 billion swing. He subpoenaed Boeing's bid archives, buried deep in a secure vault. Among the spreadsheets he spotted cells highlighted in pink, values matching Lockheed numbers down to the dollar. Margins had been shaved not randomly but systematically, as if someone knew each threshold to the second decimal. Bayer requested emails of the Delta proposal team. One chain chilled the room. A manager wrote, "Thanks, Ken. These LM figs help us nail the cost story." Another replied, "With their risk premium exposed, we can beat them at every weight class." The paper trail was blunt enough to slice steel. Search warrants followed. Agents seized Branch's home computer and found scans of Lockheed watermark patterns embedded in his recycle bin. Boeing's Washington lobbyists braced for fallout. Space launch contracts touch every congressional district with parts suppliers. The Justice Department convened a grand jury. Headlines roared, "Boeing accused of rocket espionage." Defense analysts called it the biggest industrial theft scandal since the Cold War. In July 2003, the Pentagon took a weapon seldom used against Fortune 500 contractors: suspension. Boeing was barred from new launch contracts for 20 months. Satellites worth billions sat in clean rooms awaiting rides that suddenly belonged to Lockheed. Investors panicked. Boeing stock dipped 8% in a day. Internally, engineers joked darkly that the company had achieved escape velocity, only in reverse. Branch pled guilty to conspiracy to steal trade secrets. At sentencing, he spoke barely above a whisper, "I thought I was just helping my new team compete." The judge countered that he had jeopardized military readiness and trust in the aerospace backbone. Branch received a 2-year prison term and a lifetime ban from defense work. Boeing's vice president of space systems resigned abruptly and later testified under immunity. Facing civil suits, Boeing agreed in 2006 to pay Lockheed $298 million and forfeit 3 launches. The two adversaries, battered and wary, later merged their rocket divisions into a joint venture, United Launch Alliance, created largely to reassure the government such cutthroat leaks would never happen again. In irony worthy of orbital mechanics, the folder that split them ultimately forced them into the same cockpit. Inside Boeing today, a framed photo hangs in the ethics hall, a plain manila folder resting on a launch pad schematic. Beneath it, a caption in calm sans serif reads, "The most powerful payload is information. Handle with gravity." New hires must initial a clause stating that bringing any competitor document into a Boeing facility is grounds for immediate termination. No exceptions, no excuses, no second countdown. Lockheed likewise hardened protocols: biometric safes, randomized audits, escort rules for any departing employee. In orientation slides a red banner flashes, "Never be the last person alone with the folder." The reminder feels melodramatic until someone recounts the night T-12 hours turned into a multi-billion-dollar detour. Kenneth Branch now lives quietly in rural Florida, repairing outboard motors and watching rocket launches on a portable TV. When Delta or Atlas boosters arc into the blue, he sometimes turns away before the first stage separation, as if the sight still burns. Those who know him say he never speaks of the manila folder, only of how silence can weigh more than liquid hydrogen. And so, in briefing rooms from Huntsville to Toulouse, managers retell the parable. Trust is the thrust that lifts every project. Betray it, and even the mightiest rocket shudders, veers, and must share its orbit with the shadow of one flimsy, unassuming folder, passed hand to hand when no one was looking but felt explosively by everyone once the countdown ends. In the world of global finance, Barings Bank was not just a bank. It was an institution, a 233-year-old pillar of the British establishment. It was the Queen's personal bank, an entity that had financed the Napoleonic Wars and helped fund the Louisiana Purchase. Its name was synonymous with prudence, tradition, and unimpeachable stability. In the mid-1990s, the future of this venerable institution seemed to rest, improbably, in the hands of a 28-year-old working-class wunderkind from Watford named Nick Leeson. From his post on the frenetic trading floor of the Singapore International Monetary Exchange (SIMEX), Leeson was a golden boy, a master of the universe. He was supposedly executing a low-risk arbitrage strategy, profiting from tiny price differences in Nikkei 225 futures contracts traded in Singapore and Osaka. And he was astonishingly good at it. The profits pouring from his desk were astronomical, at times accounting for over 20% of Barings' entire annual earnings. He was a hero, a genius whose success was so spectacular that his bosses in London, dazzled by the returns, gave him a free hand and asked few questions. The source of Leeson's power and the instrument of his fraud was a critical breakdown in oversight. Uniquely, he was allowed to be both the head trader making the bets and the manager in charge of settling his own trades in the back office. This gave him the power to be his own bookkeeper, to mark his own homework. He used this power to create a secret hidden account, known only by its number, 88888. 8 is a lucky number in Chinese culture, and this was his lucky account. The 88888 account was where reality went to die. When Leeson's arbitrage trades went wrong, which they frequently did, he didn't report the losses. Instead, he dumped them into this secret error account. When a junior trader on his team made a mistake, the resulting loss also went into 88888. He would then report only his winning trades to London, creating the illusion of a flawless, one-way torrent of profits. The 88888 account became his financial black hole, a place to hide every mistake, every bad bet, every inconvenient truth. He funded the growing losses by creating fictitious trades, essentially stealing money from other parts of the bank to cover the margin calls on his secret account. For a time the scheme worked. The hole in the 88888 account grew, but so did Leeson's reputation and the bonuses he was paid. He believed he could trade his way out of the ever-deepening hole. He began making larger and more aggressive directional bets on the market, no longer arbitraging but gambling, hoping a big win would erase his secret losses. The event that triggered the final, catastrophic collapse was an act of God. On January 17, 1995, the Great Hanshin earthquake devastated the city of Kobe, Japan. In the immediate aftermath, Leeson made his biggest and most reckless gamble. Convinced the Japanese economy and the Nikkei index would rally swiftly, he placed a massive bet on its recovery. He bought tens of thousands of futures contracts, essentially single-handedly betting the bank on a market rise. But the market didn't rise, it plunged. As the full extent of the earthquake's damage became clear, the Nikkei plummeted. Leeson's losses, already in the tens of millions, began to multiply with terrifying speed. He doubled down, then doubled down again, desperately trying to prop up the market. But he was fighting gravity itself. The hole in the 88888 account exploded, growing from a manageable problem into a chasm of hundreds of millions of pounds. The margin calls from the exchange became relentless, a tidal wave of debt he could no longer hide. Realizing the game was over, on February 23, 1995, Nick Leeson and his wife boarded a flight and fled Singapore. He left behind a simple handwritten note on his desk that read, "I'm sorry." Back in London, auditors, finally alerted that something was terribly wrong, descended on the Singapore office. They found the 88888 account. Inside it was a loss totaling £827 million, roughly $1.4 billion. It was more than double the entire trading capital of Barings Bank. The discovery sent a shockwave through the global financial system. The Bank of England attempted a weekend bailout, but the hole was too deep. On February 26, 1995, Barings Bank, the financial institution that had survived centuries of war and economic turmoil, was declared insolvent. The once proud bank was sold to the Dutch company ING for the symbolic sum of £1. The golden boy of Singapore, captured days later in Germany, had single-handedly destroyed a 233-year-old empire, not with a complex scheme, but with a simple lie hidden in a secret account. The photocopier's lamp slid beneath a scarlet binder packed with 780 pages of top-secret schematics, and for a single breathless moment in a Surrey print shop the entire future of Formula One racing lay exposed under fluorescent light. Nigel Stepney, Ferrari's veteran race team engineer, had driven through the night from Maranello, the Italian still asleep, the binder belted into the passenger seat like a silent accomplice. 4 months Stepney had simmered, passed over for promotion, uneasy with new management, sure his brilliance was taken for granted. Across the English Channel his old colleague Mike Coughlin, now chief designer for McLaren, nursed a complimentary frustration. McLaren's silver cars kept finishing behind Ferrari's red ones, and sponsorship renewals hinged on closing the gap before the next Grand Prix. Their late-night phone calls grew longer, drifting from gossip to possibility and finally to conspiracy. Stepney promised the keys to the kingdom, if Coughlin promised respect, and maybe a future role, once the tide turned. Coughlin's wife, Trudy, handled the logistics. She found a quiet copy shop in Woking that opened at dawn, well before commuters filled the car park. On April 29, 2007 she carried the red binder to the counter and asked the sleepy attendant to duplicate the entire contents, double-sided, no questions. The young clerk glanced at the Ferrari prancing horse watermark on the title page, but customers with high-performance cars were common in Surrey. He shrugged and fed the pages into the machine. By sunrise 2 fresh sets of Ferrari's 2007 technical dossier, aerodynamic data, tire pressure curves, pit stop choreography, even a confidential wind tunnel correlation table, were sealed in clear plastic sleeves. One went into a household cupboard marked recipes, the other traveled to McLaren's design office, slipped beneath Coughlin's drafting table. Formula One paddocks thrum with rumor, and soon whispers of an inside advantage flitted between motorhomes. Ferrari noticed subtle echoes of its own innovations on McLaren's MP4-22 chassis, twin-bridge front wings, bargeboard cutouts matching Maranello's unreleased CAD renders. Stepney's colleagues voiced suspicions. He deflected with jokes, but looked increasingly haggard. Meanwhile Coughlin's drafts evolved at uncanny speed. Simulation teams murmured that the wind tunnel suddenly loves us. The scheme began to unravel over something small. Stepney ordered a batch of white powder from a local chemical supplier. He claimed it was for honest testing, yet a Ferrari quality control inspector feared sabotage and alerted security. Management launched a quiet internal probe. Stepney, feeling the net tighten, texted Coughlin, "We need insurance. Keep everything safe." Coughlin moved the binder from his office to his home study, hiding it behind children's board games. Ferrari filed a criminal complaint in Medina, naming Stepney in vague terms. Italian police tapped phones. British investigators alerted McLaren. On July 3, an FIA official phoned Ron Dennis, McLaren's stoic team principal, requesting an urgent meeting. Dennis, unflappable until then, listened as detectives described Trudy Coughlin's copy shop visit. CCTV stills showed the red binder, unmistakable. Dennis confronted Coughlin, who folded within minutes, retrieving the files from the cupboard. Dennis called Ferrari's Jean Todt, voice trembling, to confess possession of the documents but claimed no competitive benefit had been taken. Todt was ice, return them and prepare for consequences. The FIA convened an extraordinary World Motorsport Council in Paris. Evidence spilled across mahogany tables. Emails from Stepney outlining Ferrari's pit stop fuel masses, margin notes in Coughlin's handwriting comparing Ferrari's suspension geometry to McLaren's, and testimony from mechanics who saw Coughlin thumbing through red-bordered papers in the garage. Stepney, unreachable, vacationed on a Philippine beach and issued denials by fax. On July 26 the council delivered a provisional verdict. Stepney and Coughlin were guilty of possessing unauthorized data, but McLaren escaped penalty for lack of proof it had used the secrets. Ferrari fumed. The paddock split into camps. Fans coined the scandal Spygate. Then a smoking gun email surfaced. McLaren test driver Pedro de la Rosa had written to race driver Fernando Alonso, "Ferrari's tire numbers are from Nigel, but please keep to yourself." Suddenly, possession turned into use. A second hearing in September felt like a sentencing. The council fined McLaren a record, $100 million, and stripped every constructors' championship point for the 2007 season, the harshest penalty in motorsport history. Gasps echoed. Mechanics later said the Woking factory fell silent, as though the power had been cut. Stepney and Coughlin received lifetime bans, later reduced on appeal, their careers shattered like carbon fiber after a crash. Ferrari went on to edge McLaren for both titles that year, a victory tainted yet vindicating. Behind closed doors, the team installed biometric safes, introduced paper tracking microdots, and enforced need-to-know access even among senior engineers. McLaren rewrote its ethics manual, created a red channel requiring design staff to certify that no external IP had influenced their work, and began shredding drafts daily. In orientation today, new hires at both teams view a grainy image, a scarlet binder on a copier's glass caught mid-scan. A calm narrator explains, races are 1 in thousandths of a second, but a single photocopy can erase an entire season. Recruits learn that espionage is not just illicit, it is ruinously expensive, publicly humiliating, and, in a sport where brand equity fuels billion-dollar sponsorships, existential. Nigel Stepney died in a road accident years later, still protesting he had been misunderstood. Mike Coughlin found redemption designing suspension parts for NASCAR, far from the European spotlight. In quiet moments he reportedly keeps a souvenir scrap of that red binder, a reminder that brilliance untethered from integrity can spin even the fastest mind into a gravel trap. And so, under the glare of trackside floodlights from Monza to Silverstone, engineers whisper the moral. The fiercest drag is not aerodynamic, it is the weight of secrets taken under fluorescence at dawn, secrets that promise speed yet guarantee only the slow grind of scandal once the copier lamp clicks off. In the hushed, wood-paneled world of New York's financial elite, Bernard Madoff was more than a man. He was a guarantee. He wasn't a flashy gambler who chased explosive returns. He was the opposite. A bastion of stability, a quiet genius whose name was synonymous with security. To invest with Bernie Madoff was to gain entry into an exclusive club, one where the market's violent tantrums were smoothed into a gentle, predictable upward slope. For decades, he delivered on this promise with unnerving consistency. While the world's markets bucked and plunged, Madoff's clients received their statements every month showing calm, steady growth. It was a miracle of finance, and no one wanted to question a miracle. The headquarters of Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities occupied 3 floors of the Lipstick Building in Midtown Manhattan. The 17th floor was the public face of the operation, a legitimate and innovative market-making firm, bustling with traders and glowing screens. It was a high-tech, high-volume business that gave the entire enterprise an unimpeachable air of legitimacy. But the real work, the source of Madoff's legend, supposedly happened elsewhere in a small, restricted access office. This was the domain of his wealth management business, the heart of the myth. Here, Madoff claimed to work his magic using a complex but vaguely plausible strategy he called the split-strike conversion. He told his clients he was buying a basket of blue-chip stocks and hedging them with options contracts. It sounded sophisticated enough to be brilliant, and simple enough to be understood. The truth was far simpler and far more terrifying. There was no strategy. There were no trades. The bustling 17th floor was a brilliant piece of theater, a distraction from the empty stage where the real money was supposed to be. When a client sent Madoff their millions, the money was simply deposited into a bank account at Chase Manhattan. When they wanted to withdraw funds, Madoff paid them with money from that same account, money that had been deposited by newer investors. It was the oldest trick in the book, a simple Ponzi scheme, but executed on a scale so vast and with such meticulous stagecraft that it became invisible. Falsified trading confirmations and account statements were printed and mailed out, bearing the reassuring weight of official documents. They were works of fiction, props in a play that had been running for decades. For years, a few voices cried out in the wilderness. A Boston-based financial analyst named Harry Markopolos spent the better part of a decade trying to warn the Securities and Exchange Commission. He presented detailed mathematical arguments showing that Madoff's returns were a statistical impossibility. No trading strategy could produce such smooth results, impervious to market volatility. He titled one of his submissions to the regulators, "The world's largest hedge fund is a fraud." He was ignored. Madoff was too respected, too connected, a former chairman of the Nasdaq Stock Exchange. He was part of the system, and the system could not imagine that one of its own was a charlatan. Madoff himself handled inquiries from regulators with a calm, dismissive charm, treating their questions as the naive fumblings of bureaucrats who couldn't possibly comprehend his genius. The end did not come from a dogged investigator or a market watchdog. It came from the market itself. In the autumn of 2008, a wave of fear washed over the global economy. The financial crisis was in full swing and liquidity evaporated. Madoff's clients, like everyone else, were scared. They wanted their money back. The requests for redemptions, normally a steady trickle, became a flood. First tens of millions, then hundreds of millions. In total, clients asked to withdraw $7 billion. But the new money, the lifeblood of the scheme, had dried up. There were no new investors walking through the door. The vast pool of cash in the Chase account was draining away, and for the first time in his life, Bernie Madoff had no way to pay. On a cold December evening in his Manhattan penthouse apartment, the illusion finally shattered. He sat down with his two sons, Mark and Andrew, who both worked in the legitimate side of his firm. He had always kept them deliberately separate from his fraudulent advisory business. With the walls closing in, he confessed everything. He told them the wealth management arm was a fraud, one big lie. The steady returns, the secret strategy, the billions of dollars under management, it was all fake. His sons were stunned into silence, the foundation of their lives revealed to be a phantom. After absorbing the shock, they left the apartment and contacted a lawyer. The next morning, they walked into the offices of federal prosecutors. A day later, FBI agents entered Madoff's penthouse. "There is a perfectly innocent explanation," Madoff said calmly as they led him away. But there wasn't. The wizard's curtain had been pulled back, revealing not a complex machine, but an empty room and a $65 billion hole where people's futures used to be. In the early 2010s, Germany had found its tech champion. In a world dominated by American giants from Silicon Valley, Wirecard AG was a source of national pride. Headquartered in a sterile suburb of Munich, it was the darling of the Frankfurt Stock Exchange, a fintech powerhouse that promised to revolutionize how the world spent money. Its CEO, Dr. Markus Braun, was the perfect visionary for the part. An Austrian with a penchant for black turtlenecks, he spoke in lofty, abstract terms about a future of cashless societies and digital ecosystems, all powered by Wirecard's brilliant technology. The company's stock soared, eventually earning it a coveted spot in the DAX 30, Germany's most exclusive index of blue-chip companies, replacing the staid Commerzbank. Wirecard wasn't just a company, it was a declaration that old Europe could still innovate. The company's official business was payment processing. If you bought a coffee with your credit card online, a company like Wirecard acted as the invisible middleman, ensuring the merchant got paid and the transaction was secure. This was a solid, if not spectacular, business. The source of Wirecard's miraculous growth, however, was said to be in Asia. The company claimed it was generating enormous profits through a complex network of third-party partners who handled payments in markets where Wirecard itself didn't have a license. To backstop these transactions, Wirecard reported that it held vast sums of corporate cash, eventually totaling a staggering €1.9 billion, in escrow accounts managed by trustees in the Philippines. This cash was the bedrock of its balance sheet, the tangible proof of its explosive and profitable Asian operations. For years, however, a small group of journalists at the Financial Times smelled a rat. Led by reporter Dan McCrum, they published a series of articles questioning the company's accounting. They found strange inconsistencies and pointed to an acquisition in India where the numbers simply didn't add up. Each time the FT published a story, Wirecard's reaction was not one of clarification, but of furious aggression. The company accused the journalists of colluding with villainous short sellers to manipulate the stock price. Germany's own financial regulator, BaFin, seemed to agree. In a stunning move, it launched a criminal investigation not into Wirecard, but into the FT journalists, and even temporarily banned the short selling of Wirecard stock, effectively shielding the company from its critics. The German establishment had picked its side, and it wasn't with the skeptical press. The pressure, however, continued to mount. Whistleblowers emerged from within Wirecard's own legal department in Singapore, leaking documents that detailed a scheme to fraudulently inflate sales and profit figures. The allegations were now too serious to ignore. To silence its critics once and for all, Wirecard announced it had hired the prestigious accounting firm KPMG to conduct a special, independent audit. Marcus Braun assured investors this would vindicate the company completely. The audit dragged on for months. When the report was finally released in April 2020, it was a bombshell. KPMG stated it could not verify the existence of the bulk of Wirecard's profits from 2016 to 2018. Most damningly, they could find no conclusive evidence that the 1.9 billion euros in cash, the foundation of the company's success story, had ever existed. The end came with breathtaking speed. Wirecard's longtime auditor, Ernst & Young, was now cornered. 4 years they had signed off on the company's accounts. Now, with the KPMG report casting a dark shadow, they refused to approve the 2019 financial statements. The reason was simple: they could not locate the 1.9 billion euros. The trustee in the Philippines was uncooperative. The banks where the money was supposedly held issued statements. One had never been a client. The other had terminated its relationship with Wirecard years ago. The documents provided by Wirecard confirming the accounts were forgeries. On June 18, 2020, Wirecard was forced to make a stunning admission. In a brief press release, it announced that there was a prevailing likelihood that the 1.9 billion euros in cash did not exist. The confession sent a shockwave through the financial world. The company's stock price, which had once valued it at over 24 billion euros, collapsed by more than 99%, becoming virtually worthless in a matter of days. Marcus Braun resigned, claiming he too was a victim of a massive fraud. A few days later, he was arrested. The company's enigmatic chief operating officer, Jan Marsalek, a man with rumored ties to various intelligence agencies, was fired. He told colleagues he was flying to the Philippines to hunt for the missing money himself and prove their innocence. He then vanished without a trace, and is now one of the world's most wanted fugitives. Within a week, the once mighty Wirecard, Germany's great tech hope, filed for insolvency, having orchestrated one of the largest corporate frauds in modern history, built on nothing more than a ghost in the machine. In the hushed, wood-paneled world of New York's financial elite, Bernard Madoff was more than a man. He was a guarantee. He wasn't a flashy gambler who chased explosive returns. He was the opposite. A bastion of stability, a quiet genius whose name was synonymous with security. To invest with Bernie Madoff was to gain entry into an exclusive club, one where the market's violent tantrums were smoothed into a gentle, predictable upward slope. For decades, he delivered on this promise with unnerving consistency. While the world's markets bucked and plunged, Madoff's clients received their statements every month showing calm, steady growth. It was a miracle of finance, and no one wanted to question a miracle. The headquarters of Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities occupied 3 floors of the Lipstick Building in Midtown Manhattan. The 17th floor was the public face of the operation, a legitimate and innovative market-making firm, bustling with traders and glowing screens. It was a high-tech, high-volume business that gave the entire enterprise an unimpeachable air of legitimacy. But the real work, the source of Madoff's legend, supposedly happened elsewhere in a small, restricted access office. This was the domain of his wealth management business, the heart of the myth. Here, Madoff claimed to work his magic using a complex but vaguely plausible strategy he called the split-strike conversion. He told his clients he was buying a basket of blue-chip stocks and hedging them with options contracts. It sounded sophisticated enough to be brilliant, and simple enough to be understood. The truth was far simpler and far more terrifying. There was no strategy. There were no trades. The bustling 17th floor was a brilliant piece of theater, a distraction from the empty stage where the real money was supposed to be. When a client sent Madoff their millions, the money was simply deposited into a bank account at Chase Manhattan. When they wanted to withdraw funds, Madoff paid them with money from that same account, money that had been deposited by newer investors. It was the oldest trick in the book, a simple Ponzi scheme, but executed on a scale so vast and with such meticulous stagecraft that it became invisible. Falsified trading confirmations and account statements were printed and mailed out, bearing the reassuring weight of official documents. They were works of fiction, props in a play that had been running for decades. For years, a few voices cried out in the wilderness. A Boston-based financial analyst named Harry Markopolos spent the better part of a decade trying to warn the Securities and Exchange Commission. He presented detailed mathematical arguments showing that Madoff's returns were a statistical impossibility. No trading strategy could produce such smooth results, impervious to market volatility. He titled one of his submissions to the regulators, "The world's largest hedge fund is a fraud." He was ignored. Madoff was too respected, too connected, a former chairman of the Nasdaq Stock Exchange. He was part of the system, and the system could not imagine that one of its own was a charlatan. Madoff himself handled inquiries from regulators with a calm, dismissive charm, treating their questions as the naive fumblings of bureaucrats who couldn't possibly comprehend his genius. The end did not come from a dogged investigator or a market watchdog. It came from the market itself. In the autumn of 2008, a wave of fear washed over the global economy. The financial crisis was in full swing and liquidity evaporated. Madoff's clients, like everyone else, were scared. They wanted their money back. The requests for redemptions, normally a steady trickle, became a flood. First tens of millions, then hundreds of millions. In total, clients asked to withdraw $7 billion. But the new money, the lifeblood of the scheme, had dried up. There were no new investors walking through the door. The vast pool of cash in the Chase account was draining away, and for the first time in his life, Bernie Madoff had no way to pay. On a cold December evening in his Manhattan penthouse apartment, the illusion finally shattered. He sat down with his two sons, Mark and Andrew, who both worked in the legitimate side of his firm. He had always kept them deliberately separate from his fraudulent advisory business. With the walls closing in, he confessed everything. He told them the wealth management arm was a fraud, one big lie. The steady returns, the secret strategy, the billions of dollars under management, it was all fake. His sons were stunned into silence, the foundation of their lives revealed to be a phantom. After absorbing the shock, they left the apartment and contacted a lawyer. The next morning, they walked into the offices of federal prosecutors. A day later, FBI agents entered Madoff's penthouse. "There is a perfectly innocent explanation," Madoff said calmly as they led him away. But there wasn't. The wizard's curtain had been pulled back, revealing not a complex machine, but an empty room and a $65 billion hole where people's futures used to be. In the rarefied air of the European art world, masterpieces are more than just paintings. They are relics, imbued with history, genius, and immense value. Between the late 1990s and 2010, this world was electrified by a series of extraordinary discoveries. Long-lost works by modernist masters like Max Ernst, Fernand Léger, and Heinrich Campendonck began to surface from a mysterious source. These were not mere sketches, but brilliant, vibrant canvases that had supposedly been hidden away for decades, part of a forgotten collection. Auction houses like Christie's and Sotheby's vied to represent them, and esteemed experts authenticated them with scholarly enthusiasm. Each painting sold for millions, celebrated as a rediscovered piece of cultural heritage. The source of these treasures was a charming and enigmatic couple, Wolfgang and Helene Beltracchi. They lived a life of bohemian luxury, flitting between their grand homes in Germany and the south of France. Their story was as compelling as the art itself. Helene, they explained, had inherited the collection from her grandfather, Werner Jaegers, a wealthy industrialist who had bought the works in the 1920s and 30s and hidden them on his estate to protect them from the Nazis. To prove it, they produced faded, black-and-white photographs of Helene's grandmother, posing elegantly in front of a wall decorated with the now-famous paintings. The story was perfect. It had a historical narrative, a touch of anti-fascist romance, and just enough obscurity to be plausible. Wolfgang Beltracchi was the artist in the shadows. He wasn't a copyist forging existing paintings. His genius was far more audacious. He would immerse himself in an artist's life, reading their letters, studying their techniques, and understanding their psychology. Then he would imagine a work that the artist could have created, a missing piece from a known series or a painting mentioned in a letter but believed lost. He would hunt for period-correct canvases at flea markets, mix his own paints using old formulas, and bake the finished canvases in a custom oven to artificially age the craquelure. His final touch was the provenance. He created counterfeit gallery labels from long-defunct art dealers, like the legendary Alfred Flecktheme, and pasted them onto the backs of the paintings. The old photographs of Helene's grandmother were a masterstroke of staging. Wolfgang had dressed his wife in period clothing and photographed her with his own forgeries. He wasn't just faking a painting, he was faking its entire history. For over a decade, the scheme was flawless. Beltracchi's works hung in museums and graced the walls of wealthy collectors. The art world, seduced by the romance of discovery and the prospect of massive profits, had little incentive to look too closely. The downfall came not from a discerning eye, but from a single, anachronistic molecule. In 2008, a collector who had purchased a Heinrich Campendonck painting titled Red Picture with Horses for nearly €3 million decided to have it authenticated for insurance purposes. He sent it to a respected scientific analyst, Dr. Nicholas Eastaugh. The analysis was expected to be a formality. Dr. Eastaugh took a microscopic sample of the paint. Under examination, everything seemed correct. The pigments, the binders, the canvas fibers were all consistent with the supposed date of 1914. But a deeper chemical analysis revealed something impossible. Buried within the layers of paint was a trace of titanium white. While titanium dioxide was discovered in the 19th century, the specific pigment form used in the painting, a pure anatase without rutile, was not commercially developed and sold as an artist's pigment until 1921. It was a fatal slip, a tiny grain of modern chemistry in a supposedly antique masterpiece. The painting was a fake. This one discovery unspooled the entire conspiracy. Investigators, now armed with a specific chemical signature to look for, began re-examining other works from the supposed Jaegers collection. One after another, the paintings failed the test. The web of forgeries, so carefully woven over years, began to unravel. Beltracchi, who had meticulously researched every other detail, had made one lazy mistake, grabbing a tube of paint without checking its precise chemical history. In August 2010, German police, tracking the couple from a distance, watched as Wolfgang Beltracchi drove from his home in Freiburg to a local hardware store. When he returned, they swooped in. The great art boom was over. Beltracchi later confessed to forging hundreds of paintings by more than 50 different artists, cheating the art world out of an estimated €100 million. He had exposed the industry's deepest secret, that in the rush for profit and prestige, experts often see what they want to believe, and a beautiful lie can be more valuable than the truth. In the heart of Silicon Valley, a place built on audacious dreams and disruptive technology, a new icon emerged in the early 2000s. Elizabeth Holmes was not just another entrepreneur. She was a visionary, hailed as the next Steve Jobs. She had the uniform, a closet full of black turtlenecks, the deep, commanding voice, and a story that was almost too good to be true. At 19, she dropped out of Stanford University with a mission to revolutionize healthcare. Her company, Theranos, promised to do what seemed impossible: run hundreds of complex blood tests, from cholesterol levels to cancer markers, from a single painless drop of blood pricked from a fingertip. The vessel for this miracle was a small, sleek box called the Edison machine. Holmes painted a vivid picture of a future where these devices would be in every pharmacy, every living room, empowering people to take control of their own health. The pitch was irresistible. It tapped into a universal desire for accessible, affordable healthcare and a deep-seated fear of needles. Money and influence flowed into Theranos with astonishing speed. Media mogul Rupert Murdoch invested over $100 million. The Walton family, founders of Walmart, invested $150 million. The company's board became a who's who of American power, including two former Secretaries of State, Henry Kissinger and George Shultz. By 2014, Theranos was valued at over $9 billion, and Holmes, its charismatic founder, was the world's youngest self-made female billionaire. Behind the locked doors of Theranos' Palo Alto headquarters, however, the reality was a world away from the dazzling public image. The Edison machine, the cornerstone of the entire enterprise, was a catastrophic failure. It produced wildly inaccurate results, it could only perform a small fraction of the tests promised, and it frequently malfunctioned. The vision Holmes sold to investors, partners, and the public was a complete fabrication. To perpetuate the myth, Theranos engaged in a breathtakingly bold deception. When it needed to process blood tests, either for its wellness centers in Walgreens stores or for demonstrations to potential partners, the company would secretly use standard, commercially available blood analyzers from competitors like Siemens, the very machines its technology was supposed to make obsolete. The tiny nanotainer collecting the drop of blood was often quietly diluted so it could be run on these conventional machines, a practice that further compromised the accuracy of the results. The company was run not like a tech startup, but like a totalitarian state built on paranoia. Employees were compartmentalized, forbidden from speaking to colleagues in other departments. Dissent was met with swift termination and threats of litigation. Holmes and her secretive second-in-command, Sunny Balwani, ruled with an iron fist, fostering a culture of fear that ensured the secret was kept. They controlled every piece of information, creating a Potemkin village for outsiders. When distinguished guests like then Vice President Joe Biden toured the facility, they were shown a carefully staged lab where nothing was quite what it seemed. The first cracks in the fortress appeared not from regulators, but from a persistent journalist. In 2015, John Carreyrou of the Wall Street Journal received a tip from a medical expert who was deeply suspicious of Theranos' claims. Carreyrou began digging, and soon he found a source inside the company, a young lab employee named Tyler Schultz. Schultz was not just any employee, he was the grandson of board member and former Secretary of State George Schultz. Horrified by the fraud he was witnessing, Tyler tried to warn his grandfather, but the elder Schultz was completely captivated by Holmes's charisma and refused to believe him. Undeterred, Tyler, along with other brave whistleblowers, began speaking to Carreyrou, providing him with the damning evidence he needed. When Holmes learned of Carreyrou's investigation, she deployed the full force of her legal team, led by the fearsome litigator David Boies, to kill the story. They intimidated sources, sent threatening letters to the Journal, and tried to discredit Carreyrou. But it was too late. In October 2015, the Journal published its explosive exposé, revealing the technological failures and the covert use of commercial analyzers. Holmes went on a media blitz, denying everything with her unwavering, deep-voiced calm. "This is what happens when you work to change things," she declared on television. "First they think you're crazy, then they fight you, and then all of a sudden you change the world." But her performance could no longer hold back the truth. The article opened the floodgates. Federal regulators from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, launched an investigation and found major deficiencies in the labs, declaring that Theranos posed an immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. Walgreens severed its partnership, shuttering all 40 of its Theranos wellness centers. The SEC filed charges for massive fraud. The $9 billion valuation evaporated into thin air. The elixir of health that Holmes had promised was revealed to be nothing but silence and deceit, a cautionary tale of how a compelling story in the right hands can be the most dangerous kind of lie.